It feels a little crazy that 2025 came and went as fast as it did. This year ended up being stacked with so many new heavy hitters that it was honestly really difficult to keep up. Granted, it's unrealistic to be able to play absolutely everything in any given year, but looking back, I was pleasantly surprised to find that I ended up beating a bunch more games than I expected this year. Now, I'm not just talking about the games released during this year. I'm also talking about the games outside of 2025 as well. From ones that I initially missed out on these past couple of years, to others that have been out for decades at this point. With that in mind, these are the games that I played in 2025. To anyone that has been to my Twitch live streams for some time now, you might recall that for the past few years, I've done end-of-year recaps talking about all of the games I both streamed and played on my own spare time. While these were honestly just hastily thrown together PowerPoint presentations, it was fun to reflect on everything I managed to both play and finish. For 2025, I wanted to mix things up and instead put all of that energy into a full-fledged video. Now, I won't lie. The entire format of this video was 100% inspired by My Life in Gaming's yearly The Games We Played videos. But hey, those videos were the inspiration I needed to be able to sit down and properly compile all of my thoughts about everything I played this past year. Anyways, I got a lot to talk about, so why don't we kick things off with two games that got carried over from 2024. I grabbed myself a copy of Helldivers 2 right near the tail end of 2024 when it was on sale. This 4-player online co-op shooter managed to keep me fairly occupied for a few months going into the new year. My original intent was to play with some of my friends that already had the game before me, but that unfortunately did not pan out, leaving me to fend for myself with randoms. And aside from one very specific bad experience, hopping into missions with strangers made the Helldivers 2 experience a lot more fun than I was anticipating. The game's bombastic approach to all-out warfare against the game's 3 enemy factions is honestly kind of insane. Having new enemy types to deal with the higher you go in the game's multitude of difficulty levels is something that I can appreciate compared to most games opting for a simple health and damage increase on harder settings. Missions can get out of hand really quick, but thanks to the numerous amounts of weapons and stratagems at your disposal, things can get even crazier. But it's that kind of chaotic element that adds so much to Helldivers 2 that I couldn't help but be engaged anytime I logged on for a few hours. When seemingly endless amounts of explosions and carnage happens all around you, it's a sight to behold. And after about 80 hours of on and off play, I even managed to get the Platinum Trophy on PlayStation 5. I did end up falling off the game shortly after that, since I no longer felt compelled to play more to unlock more upgrades and stratagems, though I did witness a small bit of the invasion of Super Earth that happened during a pivotal live game event. I also never felt motivated to get much of the new war bonds that keep releasing, since it requires premium currency that you can buy with real money. To the game's credit, you can 100% earn said currency in-game, but it can take quite a bit of time even with optimal farming methods, which I actually ended up doing a fair amount of myself. I've slowly been trying to shift away from live service games these days, but Helldivers 2 gave me a co-op experience that I couldn't help but seriously have a blast with. It may not be something I'm constantly logging back into play now, but I'm keeping it installed because as of 2026, a couple of my friends have started to play more. What can I say? If they want to help spread some democracy, I'll be there to join them. The other game that I started really late into 2024 was Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Coming from Machine Games, the studio responsible for the newer set of Wolfenstein games, this one ended up being a pleasant surprise for me for a number of reasons. I had my reservations going into Great Circle since the studio's last main project was 2019's massively underwhelming Wolfenstein Youngblood. And when it comes to the world of Indiana Jones, my experience with it has been embarrassingly limited. Don't believe me? What if I told you that the only movies I've seen were both Kingdom of the Crystal Skull and Dial of Destiny, and that I didn't hate them? Yeah, I know. I'll make sure to watch the first 3 films someday, but let's get back on topic. I initially wasn't sure how I was going to feel about the first-person perspective for something like an Indiana Jones game, but I think they pulled it off really well here. The big surprise for me was finding that it leans more towards being a sort of immersive sim-style game, providing the tools to give Indy a number of options to explore inside the game's multiple open-ended areas. During my playthrough, I always tended to aim for the more stealthy approach whenever possible, utilizing disguises to avoid unnecessary conflict. It's not always like this, as some portions of the game has its fair share of linear set-piece moments too, but they felt well placed in between the more open gameplay segments. While I wouldn't say the game's combat is anything more than decent, I mean the AI here isn't exactly the smartest bunch around, I was a fan of being able to take certain objects from the environment to be able to use in the spur of the moment. And even though my experience with the franchise is super limited, I enjoyed the story of Great Circle quite a bit. I found the cast of characters and the main villain to be enjoyable, and I do have to admit that Troy Baker manages to pull off a pretty solid Harrison Ford impression, even if some of his normal Troy voice manages to slip through the cracks from time to time.
You could have killed us!
I may not be in the position to say how Indiana Jones and the Great Circle stacks up to the other games or even the films in the series, but I had a much better time with this game than I was anticipating. It looks and runs great on Series X, and I was even motivated to go back for 100% completion to unlock the extra ending. There is also that Order of Giants DLC, but I'm honestly not going to bother with it unless it goes on a deep discount. But when it comes to the Great Circle by itself, this Indiana Jones adventure was one that was well worth taking. Having wrapped up these games early enough in the year on my own, I was able to start my year of streaming with a clean slate. So what better way to kick off the year than to fulfill some obligations from hitting a couple of channel milestones? Thanks to reaching my goal of 150 followers over on my Twitch channel, I began 2025 with a playthrough of Paper Mario Sticker Star. Now look, I don't need to be reminded of the kind of reputation this game has garnered over the years. It always feels like anytime the words Paper Mario are mentioned, Sticker Star has to be brought up in the conversation like the game committed arson or killed someone's pet dog. Okay, that might be a bit extreme, but you get the idea. Since I'm someone that has yet to even get started on the Paper Mario series, I always wanted to knock this one off of my to-do list and give this game a fair shot entirely on its own terms. And as crazy as it sounds, I had a fun enough time with the game. I wouldn't go as far as to call Sticker Star a hidden gem by any means, but I was led to believe that this game was far worse than what I actually ended up experiencing for myself. While there's nothing necessarily wrong with it, the main plot is a mostly standard and pretty forgettable affair. There's also not much going on in terms of characters here either. Kirsty, Mario's new companion for example, isn't compelling or even likable enough for me to have cared about where things were headed next with her tagging along. Sticker Star's world structure does follow a much more traditional Mario formula, so outside of a couple of standout areas like the Enig Mansion and the pyramid with the tall and skinny toad wall paintings, many of the levels you'll be visiting, while fun enough, aren't anything to write home about. I think the number one thing that surprised me was, outside of some very notable flaws which I will get into in a bit, I didn't really mind the sticker-based battle system all that much. Planning out your attacks based on the enemies you're fighting and the active nature of attacking and defending works well enough here. The decision to make attacks consumables isn't exactly an ideal one, but the game constantly had easy ways for me to stock back up on stickers, so for a majority of the game, I actually kept running out of inventory space more than anything. The only true instance where this design decision reared its ugly head was during the boss fights. In theory, they would have been some of the highlights of the game, but having them essentially be forced puzzle bosses requiring the use of a specific thing sticker, special stickers based on real-life objects, to help make these fights actually fun and not a huge pain, really dragged them down for me. The game does try to give hints on what objects would be effective, but a lot of them aren't exactly the most obvious to figure out. This was absolutely amplified during the final boss fight against Bowser. Yes, spoilers, he's the final boss. Since I ran out of attack-based stickers that would actually damage Bowser, and with him being the only boss you can't flee from, The fight had basically become unwinnable, forcing me to get a game over. I did plan accordingly on my second attempt and got through it, but that first run was a bit of a sobering experience, let me tell you. Sticker Star is a flawed game for sure, but it's one where I feel like I didn't waste my time playing it either. While it is hard for me to ignore the number of issues I had during my playthrough, I simply can't bring myself to call this the worst thing ever, or something even remotely close to that. To be clear, I don't consider Sticker Star an amazing game or anything like that either. It's just something that I would call a borderline average video game. I would only really give it a low priority recommendation if anything, since there are much better options for Paper Mario games out there. As for me, the Nintendo 64 original is next on my Paper Mario to-do list, so we'll see how that one goes whenever I finally get around to it. On the flip side, Amy for the Xbox Live Arcade is what I would call an absolute stinker of a video game. Right around the time the Xbox 360 store was shutting down, I was reminded that this game existed and streamed the free demo with absolutely zero intent to buy it before the store closure. That is, until a generous chat member felt the need to donate money to cover the $5 cost of the game just for me to stream it. In hindsight, I really should have just paid those $5 back. Because of this, and the added goal of reaching 160 followers on Twitch, I reluctantly followed up on my promise to play Amy all the way through. And yeah, it was just as bad as I was expecting, if not worse. The best way I could describe Amy is that it's a linear survival horror game with a dose of stealth thrown into the mix. Since Amy, the titular character, is an 8-year-old child, you play as her protector Lana in an effort to make it through a city filled with zombies. And since Amy has supernatural powers, an evil corporation is intent on tracking her down as well. I mean, who can blame them? This nonverbal child is so powerful, not only can she shoot shockwaves to knock enemies over, she's even smart enough to hack computers. Look, you'll just have to take my word for it. It's not like the game does a good job explaining why she's able to do this. Most of the game boils down to you and Amy solving environmental puzzles and fighting through or sneaking past a number of zombies. Despite being what can only be described as one giant escort mission, that aspect actually ends up being the least of Amy's numerous issues. This is a pretty ugly looking game, even for the era it came out in. It may be a budget downloadable title, but the drab looking environments and the poor and inconsistent frame rate makes it pretty rough to sit through its less than 4-hour runtime. And the gameplay, while not outright unplayable by any means, does nothing to save this game from being a total mess. Combat is straightforward with breakable weapons and a clunky dodge maneuver, and due to the ongoing infection, Lana has to avoid zombification with a limited supply of injections. Alternatively, Amy's aforementioned powers does allow for an extra means to heal the ongoing infection, provided you stay really close to her. Interestingly enough, having a high infection rate plays into some of the stealth, allowing you to sort of blend in with the zombies in order to sneak by them safely. While a neat idea, this mechanic doesn't get played around with all that often, but it becomes a requirement in a later level that features one of the worst instant failure stealth segments I've come across in a long while. It got so bad due to Amy being a liability for getting spotted by the shoddy AI, I had to go look up a guide to see exactly what I had to do. It was pretty miserable. It's pretty hard for me to even come up with anything good to say about Amy. There may be a decent idea or two hiding deep within the numerous layers of jank, but despite getting a few unintentional laughs out of it, this is easily one of the worst games I've managed to beat in 2025. While the 360 store may be gone for good, the PS3 version should still be available on its storefront, if for some reason you're really curious about playing Amy yourself. Just do me a huge favor. Don't. Being a huge fan of Half-Life 2, the console port for the original Xbox was always a curiosity of mine. Having already played Gearbox's surprisingly good PS2 port of the first Half-Life the year prior, I was in the mood to finally revisit Half-Life 2 and see its very first console version in action. As obvious as it may seem, the Xbox version doesn't come close to how it handles on the PC, or hell, even the 360 version included in the orange box just 2 years later. But for what it's worth, it's honestly impressive to see how they managed to get this game running on the Xbox in the first place. The shooting controls and overall feel of the game are all solid and translate really well to the Xbox gamepad, and the added ability to remap the buttons to a preferred layout will always get kudos from me. Of course, the visuals and texture work are a noticeable downgrade from what was even possible on the PC at the time, but I'd still go as far as to say it looks decent for the console. However, the most obvious downside to the Xbox version is by far the frame rate. There are plenty of instances where the game struggles to maintain its target when the action and visual effects ramp up, with only some rare moments where it gets really bad. But you know, replaying all of Half-Life 2, albeit a lesser version of it, was still a lot of fun. The pacing of the game is still excellent after all these years, and it just felt really nice to step into the boots of Gordon Freeman once again after not having played the game in quite some time. The Xbox version is by no means the ideal method to play Half-Life 2 nowadays, but I think it should be commended as a very ambitious port to a console that tried its very best to even handle it. Having finished both The Man Who Erased His Name and Infinite Wealth in 2024, I had finally caught up to date with the Yakuza / Like a Dragon series, ready for whatever came next. Aiming to do something a little bit different for their next side game, RGG Studio gave us Like a Dragon, Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii. Out of all of the non-mainline entries in the series, not counting the 2 Judgment games, Pirate Yakuza might actually be the most fun I've had compared to them all. It's a game that feels like it knows exactly what it wants to be, and ends up all the better for it. Longtime series mainstay Goro Majima gets hit with amnesia after washing ashore on a beach, and not long after becomes the captain of a ragtag group of pirates. I'm generalizing a bit here, of course, but that's really the primary gist of the plot without going too deep into spoiler territory. I should warn, though, that a few key plot points from the last mainline entry, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, do get spoiled here, but other than that, Majima's swashbuckling adventure is very much a standalone affair, with a fun cast of characters and some story elements that longtime fans should get a kick out of. While some may cry foul at this, I played using the English dub and I thought that Matt Mercer is a good fit for Majima. He obviously doesn't come anywhere close to Hidenari Ugaki's iconic Japanese performance, and in the dubs prior to Pirate Yakuza, I wasn't entirely sold on Mercer's Majima. But this time around, I finally felt convinced that he does a great job in the English role.
That don't sound half bad.
Like the name suggests, Hawaii makes a return from Infinite Wealth as the game's primary setting, allowing you to run around beating up some thugs along the way, and get sidetracked by the various returning minigames in arcade games. While on the subject of the arcade games, I guess I can go ahead and add Virtua Fighter 3, The Ocean Hunter, and Sega Racing Classic 2 Power Edition to the games I beat in 2025, thanks to them being playable in Pirate Yakuza. There's also a fair number of new sub-stories that once again provides the level of silliness that the franchise is well known for. I won't spoil it here, but there was one lengthier sub-story in particular involving one of the new main characters that gave me the biggest feeling of secondhand embarrassment that I might have ever felt, intentional as it may be on the game's part. Anyone who has already played this game will probably know exactly what I'm talking about. The new location of Madlantis, on the other hand, is not too dissimilar to the castle from The Man Who Erased His Name, with the Colosseum fights having a larger focus on the new pirate ship battles. It's also home to my current favorite iteration of the batting cage minigame with Bang Bang Batting. It ended up being far more addicting than I was expecting. Being a game about pirates, sailing around with your ever-expanding crew and getting into the previously mentioned ship battles makes up a fairly decent portion of the game here. Controlling the ship feels natural, and while the mechanics involving the combat and upgrading your ship and crew aren't complex by any means, it does provide a decent, albeit limited amount of customization to take into battle. The typical brawler-style gameplay of the non-RPG Yakuza installments feels as good as ever here, with Majima's two fighting styles bouncing between being able to dish out new air combos and pirate weapons that feel nothing short of incredibly overpowered. This is also the first time I went out of my way to go and get my first ever platinum trophy in the Yakuza series. It helps that the requirements are far less painful to deal with compared to almost every other trophy list from the franchise, but I'll take what I can get. I guess what I'm trying to say is, Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii was simply a lot of fun, even if it is just a goofy little side story. 2025 also saw the release of id Software's newest installment in the Doom series with Doom: The Dark Ages. Coming off of the fantastic Doom Eternal and its two Ancient Gods expansions, Dark Ages decided to take a different approach to its rip and tear formula this time around. It's a lot more grounded, requiring you to bob and weave through projectiles while making use of the new shield in your arsenal to parry certain projectiles and melee attacks to get up close and personal. The speed by default is also a tad bit slower than Eternal and even Doom 2016, but the whole stand your ground style of gameplay manages to be just as fun and visceral as the games that came before it. There was a little bit of a learning curve with the shield, as I kept missing the parry window later than I would have expected, but once things clicked into place, it felt so damn good. Having played on the ultra-violent setting, Dark Ages as a whole is an easier time than Eternal, mainly since the combat loop here is far less demanding. Having a steady influx of ammo allowed me to stick with the weapons I liked more often in Dark Ages, whereas Eternal opted for lower ammo pools to encourage constant weapon swapping and exploiting enemy weaknesses. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. Both games have a different goal in mind for their combat, and in my eyes, having something that's really fun for two entirely different reasons is a good thing. Well, 3 reasons if we want to throw Doom 2016 into the mix as well. Aside from the excellent shooting expected of id Software, the game does change things up with a few dragon riding segments and instances where you're in a giant mech laying waste in these kaiju-esque battles. They're fun for what they are, though not exactly deep or anything, and they don't overstay their welcome throughout the campaign. Cutscenes, on the other hand, do overstay their welcome a little bit. The more recent Doom games has had their fair share of lore, but Dark Ages has a bit more story than usual, which I didn't care for in all honesty. All I needed was the Doom Slayer to go around and kill demons, and hey, that was still what I got in the end. If you had asked me to rank the 3 most recent Doom games, I would place Dark Ages as my least favorite of the 3, followed by 2016 and then Eternal. But in no way does being 3rd place stop it from being a worthy addition to the Doom series alongside the previous 2 entries. Much like their previous efforts with A Way Out and It Takes Two, Hazelight's Split Fiction continues the studio's track record of delivering a fun and variety-filled co-op adventure. Once again dragging along my friend and fellow YouTuber/streamer Blonde Guy Gamer, the two of us spent a couple of streams getting ourselves into whatever shenanigans and gameplay ideas the game had in store for us. The occasional swap between the game's sci-fi and fantasy settings always ended up providing something new to tackle during each leg of the game. This meant that most of these co-op mechanics didn't overstay their welcome, keeping things fresh throughout this relatively lengthy journey. In fact, there are some moments in this game that are so ridiculous, we couldn't help but just appreciate how delightfully dumb the game sometimes ended up being.
Oh, now that is a
Cool, I got a fart
odor.
trophy. This game sucks. Amazing. This is the biggest fecal funny game that's ever been made. Split Fiction adheres more closely to the studio's previous game It Takes Two with its core platforming mechanics. And in a way, that did end up making the game feel just a little less special by comparison. But for my money, I actually prefer this game over It Takes Two in general thanks to what it had to offer in its gameplay variety this time around. although some of the game's coolest moments get saved for the final act. Another reason I prefer this game is that this time around, I don't have to deal with playing as a divorced couple that seriously got on my nerves. That doesn't mean that our protagonists Mio and Zoe are amazing characters by any stretch, but I'd rather deal with two amateur writers with personal issues over some really crappy parents any day. I personally can't speak for how Blondie felt about the game as a whole, though I'm fairly certain he had a good time, but playing Split Fiction with him was a lot of fun. And it might be my favorite of the 3 games I've played from Hazelight. If the studio keeps sticking with co-op games, I'd be more curious to see a bit of a shakeup and see what else they can do for co-op without resting on its current platforming laurels. Again.
Okay. Oh, Phil, Tony, hold on.
I thought I could have squeezed through that! Oh no. No, get away!
It starts so soon.
I know, it's so quick!
Oh no! Can I slow down? Hang on.
No, I can't! Go in, there you go!
There.
Alright!
Okay, there, now aim this one better.
Okay, good. One of my most anticipated games going into 2025 was Capcom's Monster Hunter Wilds. Being a fan of the series ever since I started on the Wii with Monster Hunter Tri, I've always looked forward to every new installment that would hit North America. As much as I loved every new installment, I started to get seriously burnt out with the series by the time Generations landed on the 3DS. Then 2018 came along with Monster Hunter World, which quickly became one of my favorite entries up to that point, and was my personal game of the year for 2018. It was exactly the kind of Monster Hunter game I needed to get me out of the rut I was in with the series. Since then, we did get World's Iceborne expansion, as well as Monster Hunter Rise and its subsequent Sunbreak expansion. But with Monster Hunter Wilds being the direct follow-up to World, there were plenty of reasons for me to be excited. Combine that with the game finally featuring crossplay between consoles and PC, I was fully ready to dive into the game on day one. Monster Hunter Wilds is a bit of a weird one for me. I really like this game a lot. In fact, it's one of the few games I kept coming back to throughout the whole year. The hunting feels just as good as ever, and a lot of the new combat options for the numerous weapon types are super fun and satisfying to pull off. And a lot of the new monsters introduced in this game are excellent additions to the overall roster, both from a visual standpoint and taking them on during the hunts. Unfortunately, Wild suffers from quite a few questionable design decisions that ended up dragging the experience down, not just for me, but more importantly, some of my close friends. Wilds takes a much more linear approach for progressing through its main story compared to past entries, and it honestly just comes off as a very misguided decision. Every quest forces you on rails, leading you to the next big monster fight, preventing you from straying off the path to explore even just a little bit. This results in a distinct lack of world exploration throughout low rank, which is made even more annoying as there are certain parts of the story where the game straight up locks you out of the open areas until you progress. I get trying to ease in new players that may be new to Monster Hunter, but I don't think this was the right way to go about it. I felt that a fair number of entries prior to Wilds did a good enough job to onboard newcomers to its gameplay loop, so I don't understand why Capcom decided to go for the whole railroading approach here. Making matters even worse is that trying to play through the story with friends is a complete nightmare. You can't play with each other on a quest until after a major cutscene is triggered, meaning that they can't join in from the very start. Monster Hunter World had the same exact issue with playing co-op on its story quests, and it's honestly baffling to see Capcom double down on it here. It eventually got to the point where we decided that hunting together was not worth the headache until we all reached high rank.
As soon as we find a good spot, we can get things set up and ready to go. And then we can get started.
This is gonna be great!
You bet.
Now, while I don't object to a Monster Hunter game having story elements for its single player, the overall plot here is really nothing special. I do bring it up specifically because Wilds is by far the most story-focused the mainline series has ever gotten. I never found myself caring about much of the main cast, and while some late game reveals regarding the Guardian monsters were at least a little bit interesting, I found myself being pretty much on autopilot during the whole narrative. Thankfully, once the credits roll and you reach the high rank quests, the game truly opens up and shines where it matters. Not having to deal with all of the annoyances from the story, going on hunts and playing with friends was and still is a ton of fun and feels incredible. As a side note, I should also mention that the game's post-launch monster updates have been excellent overall. The standouts for me in particular have been Lagiacrus, or Lagiacrus if you're weird like that, Omega from Final Fantasy XIV, despite not being a monster, and Gogmazios, all of which have unique aspects to their hunts that make them stand out from many others in the game. But having to get to that very point brings up my core issue with Monster Hunter Wilds. I shouldn't have to feel like I'm stuck on a leash playing low rank for nearly 12 hours. Playing with my friends during the story shouldn't have all these unnecessary headaches that prevents us from having a good time together until endgame. Playing on consoles shouldn't be the only good way to play the game due to Capcom shockingly dropping the ball really hard on the PC version. At least initially. It seems like as of 2026, things have finally gotten better. And the base game shouldn't be lacking an overall challenge and things to do, only for free updates to rectify it at a later date. Again, I should stress that I really enjoyed my time playing Monster Hunter Wilds in 2025. Hell, I still play Monster Hunter Wilds on an almost weekly basis with the River City Gamers gang. And I'd even go as far as to say that I do in fact recommend this game to anyone who may be interested. But I'd also be lying to myself if I didn't say that I felt a bit disappointed with how this one turned out. Whenever Capcom releases the upcoming expansion for Wilds, I just hope that they don't repeat the same mistakes. A few years ago, I made it a personal goal of mine to play through nearly every Castlevania game in release order over on my Twitch stream. I felt compelled to do this after streaming both Nintendo 64 Castlevania games, which, if you ask me, are much better than they are given credit for despite some of the inherent jank. There have been a good number of games in the series I've played before in the past, but playing the ones I never got to experience before has been making this endeavor such a treat, even if some installments don't end up doing anything for me. While I still have a ways to go before I'm fully caught up on Castlevania, I gotta say, I've been pretty happy with the progress I've been making. By the start of 2025, I had managed to reach the Game Boy Advance installments beginning with Castlevania Circle of the Moon. This game still holds a very special place in my heart as it was the very first GBA game I got alongside the handheld as a kid. Both it and my earlier exposure to Super Castlevania 4 on the Super Nintendo are what made me become a fan of the series. Following the formula set in place by Symphony of the Night, Circle of the Moon has you traversing yet another incarnation of Dracula's castle to take him out once more. Despite not being helmed by Koji Igarashi's team, but instead by Konami's now defunct Kobe studio, I'd say that they did a solid job for being the first exploration-based Castlevania for the handheld. It's not without its fair share of issues, some of which have only become more apparent to me as I've gotten older, but Circle of the Moon still has its merits. The most notable gameplay feature is the dual setup system, where combining action and attribute cards results in a multitude of tools for you to utilize. It's a really fun and interesting system to experiment with, but it's severely held back thanks to different cards being tied to specific enemies with very low drop rates. I'm not afraid to admit that, just for fun on this playthrough, I messed around with the very easy to do DSS exploit, where you switch to card combos you don't have mid-activation. What makes the card collecting even worse is that there are certain enemies that only show up in the game's notoriously brutal battle arena, which I honestly could not be bothered to complete. Speaking of difficulty, Circle of the Moon is by far the most difficult of the 3 GBA games. It relies more heavily on leveling up compared to most other games in the series, so there may be times where you'll have to go grind XP in order to not get decimated by some of the game's harder enemies and boss fights. For being a launch title for the GBA, the visuals are pretty decent, especially now that we no longer have to deal with the game being too dark thanks to the lack of a GBA backlight at launch. And the music, while good, does mostly rely heavily on remixes of past Castlevania tracks instead of brand new compositions. Despite all of my newfound complaints, I could totally do without having to constantly double tap the D-pad to run or the insane knockback distance, Circle of the Moon still provided me the fun Castlevania gameplay that I've come to expect from the series. It absolutely can get frustrating at times, but with previous entries now officially under my belt, I wouldn't say that's entirely unexpected. I feel like this entry has been getting dogpiled on in recent years, but I don't think it totally deserves it. Give it a shot. The second Castlevania game to hit the Game Boy Advance was Harmony of Dissonance. This time being helmed by Koji Igarashi, this was the one GBA installment I actually missed out on back when I was a kid, only getting around to it years later. It's also the one that I played the least compared to both Circle of the Moon and Aria of Sorrow. I did finish it when I got myself a cartridge back then, but I also remember that I didn't think too much of it. After revisiting it for 2025, well, I unfortunately can't say that my overall opinion of it has changed all that much. Don't get me wrong, this is still a good Castlevania game that I would easily recommend, but I don't know. There's just something about Harmony of Dissonance that doesn't really do much for me. For one, I'm not exactly the biggest fan of how this game looks from a visual standpoint. There's nothing really wrong with it, but there's elements of the sprite work here that I simply don't like. It might also have to do with how much more saturated this game is, which, to be fair, was done as a response to the criticisms of Circle of the Moon's dark visuals on the GBA screen. And yes, you can't talk about this game without bringing up the music in particular. Now, I'd go as far as to say that the musical compositions in Harmony are quite good here, but as anyone already familiar with this game should know by now, it's the sound quality that just outright kills the soundtrack. The game itself plays as great as ever, including new features like spellbooks that can change how your sub-weapons are used, and how Juiced Belmont is able to dash in both directions to make traversal really fast. Though I will say, while the dual castle gimmick is neat at first, it does make the game a tad bit tedious since there really isn't enough of a distinction between the two as a whole. And unlike Circle of the Moon, this game is much easier to get through, but I wouldn't exactly call that a negative. I may seem like I'm quite a bit down on Harmony of Dissonance, but don't take it the wrong way. This is still very much a good Castlevania game. There is enough on offer here alongside the post-game unlockables that definitely makes it worth playing through. It just also happens to still be my least favorite of the 3 GBA titles. But for my money, both this game and Circle of the Moon pale in comparison to the third and final GBA title, Castlevania Aria of Sorrow. Now this is what I'm talking about. Because I had missed out on Harmony of Dissonance as a kid, this was my next Castlevania game after Circle of the Moon, and by God did this one blow me away. So much of this game captivated me all those years ago that to this day, I would still consider this as one of my top 3 GBA games of all time. And as of this most recent replay, that opinion definitely has not changed one bit. The gameplay here is so smooth to control, and the new soul system is a ton of fun to experiment with. Sure, there is an element of luck to get certain souls to drop, but just the fact that nearly every enemy in the game has a soul you can use is pretty enticing. For only being a year apart between all 3 games, it's crazy to see how good the visuals are in Aria of Sorrow. And of course, taking the complaints about Harmony's music to heart, the soundtrack and audio quality are so much better here as well. One other thing that I definitely appreciate is that the overall difficulty here feels well balanced. It never feels as punishing as Circle of the Moon can be, nor does it feel like a cakewalk like Harmony of Dissonance was. It also has one of my favorite twists in all of Castlevania. It's honestly really neat. I think the only small complaint I have is that the game is actually quite a bit on the shorter side. It's hard for me to say if that's due to my familiarity with the game, or if it's actually a short game, but I can live with that if game length is my only real issue here. You can probably tell by now that I really love this game, but like, I can't help it. Aria of Sorrow is just that damn good. Trust me when I say that this game is absolutely worth your time, especially now that it, alongside the other GBA games, are now easy to obtain as part of M2's excellent Castlevania Advanced Collection. It's how I streamed all 3 GBA games despite owning the cartridges already. I just couldn't bring myself to mess with all of my old save files. While all of the GBA games were ones I was already familiar with, Castlevania Chronicles for the PlayStation had me move into some more uncharted territory. Serving as a port for the Japan-exclusive Akumajo Dracula for the Sharp X68000, which itself was a remake of the first Castlevania, Chronicles takes us back once again to the classic-style formula. Knowing what I was getting into well ahead of time, I opted to play the newly added Arrange mode on normal difficulty, since Classic mode is notorious for being brutally difficult. Arrange mode reduces enemy damage and eliminates knockback, gives Simon a new character sprite, and an alternate soundtrack that, I have to admit, I freaking adore. Its style is so unlike Castlevania, but I can't help but jam to a lot of these remixes. Now, while Arrange is the easier of the 2 modes, don't let that fool you into believing that Chronicles will be a walk in the park. This is by far the most frustratingly difficult Castlevania game that I've beaten up to this point. Some of the level design here is so evil that it basically guarantees that you'll take damage without advanced knowledge and practice. I can't even begin to describe how long the Clock Tower level took me to beat, not to mention how insane the werewolf boss was in particular. I do really like the updated visuals here in Chronicles. There's some solid pixel art, and the visual effects in some of the stages are really cool. And having already played the original NES Castlevania, it was nice to see how they decided to translate everything for more powerful hardware. For as mean as Castlevania Chronicles is on the difficulty front, I still had some degree of fun with the game. That will probably change big time whenever I end up going back to play original mode, which, by the way, I'm going to do once I hit my next Twitch follower goal. But until then, I'm just happy I got through this game, period. And then, we have the PlayStation 2 exclusive Castlevania Lament of Innocence. After having a bit of a false start with this game many years ago, this Castlevania streaming marathon was the best opportunity to finally sit down and give it another go. Taking place at the very beginning of the series timeline, Lament of Innocence has our protagonist Leon Belmont set out to rescue his fiancée Sarah from the clutches of a vampire. In a shocking twist for Castlevania, it's actually not Dracula this time. There really isn't a whole lot of plot in this one until way later in the game, but when it does happen, there's a fair share of interesting moments, backed up by much better than expected voice acting.
I have given up my title. And you, old man?
Pardon me, Lord Belmont. My name is Rinaldo Gandolfi.
Not unlike Capcom's own Devil May Cry, the gameplay leans much more towards combat in this one, and for the most part, it's quite a bit of fun with solid controls to boot. The sub-weapon system makes a return from Harmony of Dissonance, where the effects and heart cost change based on what colored orb is equipped. And foregoing the traditional level-up system, Leon instead learns more combos based on total enemies killed. I'm not a huge fan of this change, but I still felt that these moves unlocked at a decent enough rate based on how I was progressing through the game's main 5 areas. Speaking of which, one surprising aspect of Lament of Innocence for me was finding out that you could tackle these levels in whatever order you felt like. Each area is distinct enough with their theming, but all of them unfortunately suffer from being strung together by some rather bland and repetitive rooms and hallways. While I did say that the combat was a fair bit of fun, it does eventually fall victim to being a tad bit repetitive after a long period, though the game does throw in a fair amount of enemy variety to help try and keep things interesting. And for what it's worth, the semi-fixed camera angles surprisingly never really got in the way of the gameplay for me, outside of some very rare instances. Being released back in 2003, Lament of Innocence looks pretty good and runs really well on the PS2. The character models in particular are a standout here, although I cannot get over how ridiculous Leon's hair looks on his in-game model compared to Ayami Kojima's fantastic artwork. Overall, while I did enjoy my time with Lament of Innocence, and I do think that it's actually a bit underrated, it also ended up not being what I was expecting it to be. I think the main thing that threw me off during my time with the game was that despite having exploration, it barely felt like a Metroidvania. Maybe it actually isn't supposed to be a Metroidvania, and I just mistakenly thought it was going into it. Instead, what I got was a pretty fun, albeit kind of repetitive, action-focused Castlevania game. A close friend of mine has told me a fair bit about the follow-up Curse of Darkness, and I'm very curious to see how that one will go for me in 2026.
Welcome to SSX Tricky.
Okay, so a little bit of context here. My desire to stream SSX Tricky was admittedly formed out of frustration and spite. I won't go into too much detail, but watching a streamer I follow fumble around and complain about the game and their chat saying the game didn't age well annoyed me to the point where I decided to play my GameCube copy to prove otherwise. Playing SSX Tricky again after all this time was like riding a bike. It took barely any time at all for me to get reacclimated to everything, and it actually still feels great to play. The feedback of Run DMC playing whenever you clutch out an Uber trick is as satisfying as ever. It's even crazy how much the little details with each of the game's racetracks ended up sticking with me even after all of these years. Not to mention being blasted with the blatant early 2000s vibes of the soundtrack and the over-the-top nature of the characters here. I will say though, having gone and played the original SSX on the PS2 between now and back when I first played Tricky in my childhood, I was legitimately surprised to see how similar a lot of it was. The first game may have lacked Uber tricks that this game introduced, but seeing a lot of the courses and even some of the music being shared between the two games came as a bit of a surprise to me. Sure, there's a few new courses, and the returning ones did get quite a big overhaul, but these similarities made me feel that Tricky was less like a sequel and more of a remix of the original. That isn't a knock against Tricky. In all honesty, both games are worth playing if you're in the mood for some fun snowboarding. While SSX 3 may still hold the title for my favorite game in the series, my respect for what Tricky offers has only gone up the older I've gotten. What I'm trying to say is, Kyle Bossman is wrong once again. While on the subject of extreme sports, I ended up pulling out my GameCube copy of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 after finishing one of my stream games earlier than expected, with the intent of only playing it for a small amount of time. That small session expanded into going through an entire career run that took me about 2 whole streams. Despite never really playing the Tony Hawk games growing up, having only slightly dipped my toes into Underground 2, and more recently, the 1+2 remake that came out back in 2020, Pro Skater 3 was an incredible game to experience for the first time. The skating mechanics are so tightly designed and feel so good to control that it didn't take too much time for me to get reacquainted with the feeling of Pro Skater. I should note though, that I suck big time at this game. For as much fun as I was having skating around the levels in Pro Skater 3, I quickly got humbled on a large number of challenges, especially the score-based ones featured late into the career mode that took me hours to get right. But man, when you finally nail a good rundown, the feeling of satisfaction is nothing short of amazing. And let me tell you, my brain was not prepared to be thrown a Darth Maul unlockable after taking so damn long on the cruise ship level. While it did take some time for me to warm up to it, the soundtrack might be my current favorite out of all of the Pro Skater games, with a few songs I had never heard before worming their way into my brain, never to escape. I may not be that good at this game, but playing through Pro Skater 3 was a highlight for me this year, full stop. It got me to see Neversoft at the top of their game, which is something I can't help but seriously appreciate as a novice to the series. In a somewhat amusing turn of events, Just only 1 month after I had finished Pro Skater 3, Activision announced Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 Plus 4, the long-requested remakes of the third and fourth games. While I wasn't exactly chomping at the bits for this remake based off of the pre-release information surrounding it, I ended up grabbing the game once it went on a big enough discount. And to the game's credit, it's honestly still pretty fun to play. I didn't notice anything particularly wrong with how the skating felt. In fact, it was much easier for me since it closely follows the blueprint of the 1+2 remake. And since Pro Skater 3 was still fresh in my mind, it was quite interesting for me to see exactly how Iron Galaxy handled all of the levels from that game in particular for the remake. I unfortunately can't speak much for the original Pro Skater 4 as I haven't played it myself, but I'm well aware that one of the biggest points of contention in the remake is how that game's career structure was completely abandoned in favor of the more traditional skating goals. It is a shame in regards to preserving the actual Pro Skater 4 experience, but I think that for the most part, the goals in the fourth game's levels alongside the brand new levels are decent enough on their own. Yet, as I kept playing Pro Skater 3 Plus 4, I realized that I wasn't exactly feeling the overall vibe of the game. Something about the presentation here just feels off to me, and I don't know if it's because it seems more corporate than what I would expect out of a Tony Hawk game, but it just kept on bugging me. Another thing that I wasn't a fan of were the choices made for the soundtrack. Man, what the hell happened here? There's a fair selection of decent songs, sure, but compared to the 1+2 remake, they barely brought over the tracks featured in Pro Skater 3 and 4. With how much I've come to enjoy 3's soundtrack in particular, this actually dragged down my enjoyment to where I decided to just play the missing songs off of YouTube instead of whatever new songs took its place. There are a fair amount of things to keep you occupied in the remake, but it honestly got way too overwhelming for me to care after about 11 hours of playtime. First, I finished all the career goals, then the game threw pro goals at me, and after finishing those, I was greeted with the solo tour mode, which asks you to do all of the standard and pro goals with every single skater in the game, and there is a lot of skaters in this one. By that point, I said that I was good and decided to move on. I didn't even bother with any of the online stuff. I feel like Pro Skater 3 Plus 4 would have landed better had it been an expansion to Pro Skater 1+2, but nearly 5 years later and under a completely different studio thanks to Activision stupidly killing Vicarious Visions, this game feels like it came out far too late and far too compromised for it to hit as hard as it should have. What we got is still decent enough, but it also could have been so much more.
Foiled again!
Not content to stop with the Tony Hawk series quite yet, the last game I wanted to try out was Tony Hawk's Underground. A lot of this game feels like a proper culmination of every new mechanic and idea that Neversoft had for the franchise leading up to this point. Skating feels as good as it has ever been, now with the numerous ways to extend trick combos as much as possible. The new addition of being able to get off of your board is a neat feature, allowing you to reach certain areas a bit easier and keep combos going as long as you return to your board fast enough. I also got a huge kick out of the Create a Trick feature, doing my best to make something look incredibly stupid to throw onto my trick list. But the main standout for Underground is the inclusion of a proper story mode. The plot itself may be fairly standard, having your custom skater go from an amateur in the suburbs to eventually a skating superstar, but what helps elevate it is bearing witness to one of the most hateable villains in all of gaming with Eric Sparrow. For being your supposed friend, this dirtbag takes nearly every single opportunity to screw you over for his own personal gain, which makes eventually getting back at him all the more satisfying by the end. Level goals this time around are done by talking to various NPCs to complete objectives, something that Pro Skater 4 took a shot at originally. Again, I can't speak for that game myself, but I'd say Underground handles it fairly well here. Some objectives are more traditional with requiring certain tricks to be done or hitting a set score, while others change things up a bit, like having a rather crappy stealth mission or going around driving a car that feels pretty bad to control. And having stat increases being handled by doing specific skate-related things in the game versus finding the points in the levels was an interesting enough change here as well. Playing on the normal setting, the game was fairly steady with its difficulty curve, only getting a lot more challenging right near the end. It did get a bit frustrating, but I kept pushing on through, and when I finally wrapped things up, I looked back on my time with Underground pretty fondly. I think my only real complaint outside of getting tilted at certain challenges was that the overall soundtrack wasn't really doing it for me. There are definitely songs here that I really do like, and the gigantic track list as a whole absolutely fits with the vibe of the Tony Hawk series. It just didn't end up getting stuck in my head as much as the Pro Skater 3 soundtrack did. But again, that's more of a me thing rather than a fault of the game. So yeah, I can definitely see why Tony Hawk's Underground tends to be somewhat of a fan favorite installment. It might not be my personal favorite in the series, but it may as well be very high up there.
And yo, Merry Christmas.
Thanks.
I'll be blunt here. I consider myself to be the world's worst fighting game player. It's a genre that I constantly struggle with, but one I always find myself getting pulled towards because there's such a unique appeal to them in general. While I didn't really focus on fighting games in 2025, I did spend some time in the arcade modes in a select few here and there. Thanks to the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection, I tried out 3 of the games included in the package: Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of Superheroes, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 New Age of Heroes, and Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. Because I can't be good at this genre to save my life, and have zero desire to play against other humans, I tend to always set the AI difficulty to the lowest setting just so I can mess around with the game and see what it's like as a beginner. But here comes the first Marvel vs. Capcom game to bully me into submission with its AI. For being set on just the 1-star difficulty, I was constantly hitting roadblocks in the arcade mode to the point where it felt demoralizing to even play anymore. I did finally manage to get through all the way to the end, but man did it reinforce my negative thoughts about my lack of skill. It's infuriating as all hell too, because the first MVC is such a super cool game. Everything about the presentation, the music, and the incredible sprite work comes together to supplement the tight and frantic gameplay. I just wish I didn't have to bash my skull against a brick wall of unfun AI to even get a certain level of enjoyment out of it. Its sequel did fare a bit better for me in the AI department. While there were a few notable roadblocks during the MVC2 arcade run, none of them lasted nearly as long as what I had to go through in MVC1. Though it still definitely gave me those moments where I feel like I'm simply not good enough for these games. But just like its predecessor, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is well loved for good reason. Moving from the 2v2 to the 3v3 format adds even more options for players to utilize this game's huge roster of fighters. From the game's visuals and spectacle to the rather unique direction of the soundtrack, MVC2 is a one-of-a-kind fighting game. Just one that I'm far too afraid to ever play against real humans. Going into Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, the thing that surprised me the most was how much of the MVC blueprint was already in place here. It makes sense considering this was the game that came out before the first MVC, but it's still really cool to see. As such, there was a fair bit of familiarity playing this one, and even more shocking to me was out of all 3 of the games I played on the collection, this one gave me the least trouble on its 1-star difficulty by far. I don't know if it was a fluke or not, but I was able to get through the arcade mode without devolving into self-hatred for once. It may not be as over the top as the Marvel games after, but Marvel vs. Street Fighter is still a very solid fighting game for a lot of the same reasons I mentioned with the previous 2. One last thing I want to bring up is the Marvel vs. Capcom collection itself, which is by all means fantastic. Having all of these features like training mode, move lists, full soundtracks, artwork, and even online play for the games included shows how much love and care Capcom put into this package. I didn't end up playing everything in this collection, and despite me being total garbage at them, I would go as far as to say that both MVC 1 and 2 are super worth the price of admission by themselves. Just be extra careful if you're brave enough to face other players online.
You win.
If you thought I had a tough time with the Marvel games, it doesn't even come close to what I went through with Mortal Kombat Trilogy for the PlayStation. It's no secret that the opponent AI in pretty much every single Midway game ever made was always unfair by design. But that didn't stop me from foolishly hoping there would be a silver lining while playing through Trilogy and putting the difficulty to very easy. Surprising to absolutely no one, Very Easy does nothing to stop the game from input reading your every move just because you dare to win as much as a single match. Add on the constant load times thanks to the PlayStation, something that the most recent Legacy Collection actually alleviates, and you've got an arcade ladder experience that's just plain miserable. At least they were nice enough to give out infinite continues here, unlike the Nintendo 64 version. It bums me out so damn much that the AI had to be so obnoxious because Mortal Kombat Trilogy does have a lot going for it. Taking the AI out of the equation, I was actually having fun learning some of the characters' moves and combos. And while I wouldn't say Trilogy is balanced by any means, it still plays surprisingly well. But being punished for playing solo thanks to the cheap AI just makes me more mad than I reasonably should be. It took me over 2.5 hours to finish just the Novice Arcade Ladder, with a majority of that time being stuck on Motaro and Shao Kahn. But somehow, I finally did it after so many attempts and wasted time on the loading screens. I don't think I'm gonna bother with the arcade ladders ever again unless I decide to use cheats. Hey, if the AI is allowed to cheat, then I say it's fair game for me to cheat right back. Get the fuck out of here! Before we go and toss Midway aside, I can't forget to talk about
Midway presents War Gods.
Having played the Nintendo 64 port done by Eurocom, this game is kinda rough. It controls okay for the most part, but its method for handling any kind of 3D movement is super awkward thanks to having a dedicated 3D button. Otherwise, the game handles like most other 2D fighting games of the era. It's also not a great looking game either. The fighters are all generic archetypes and look pretty bad all things considered, though some of the jank animation can be pretty funny at times. It's also extremely bare bones, even for the time it came out in. The only things on offer here are the arcade ladder and 2-player mode. And that's it. Even some earlier Mortal Kombat games, also done by Midway, had a few more options to choose from. And since this is in fact a Midway game, the cheap AI once again rears its ugly head. Although it's not nearly as agonizing compared to what I had to deal with in Mortal Kombat Trilogy, it can still be super frustrating to fight against. Yet, on a random afternoon making sure my replacement N64 power supply was working, I did manage to beat the final boss on my last continue. While I am happy I finished the game, I'm also content with never wanting to play War Gods ever again. But I have to say, why does there have to be limited continues for the arcade mode? I mean, come on! One fighting game I was finally able to try out thanks to setting up homebrew for my PlayStation was Bloody Roar 2, or more specifically, the Bloody Roar 2 Redub project. It does exactly what you'd expect based on the name. It's Bloody Roar 2, but with an entirely new voice cast. What's cool is that this project was done during the COVID-19 lockdowns with contributions from notable voice actors in the anime and gaming scene. People like Casey Mongelo, KG Tang, Kira Buckland, and Kaylee Mills, just to name a few. Casey in particular was the one who was very kind to offer me a physical disc of the redub to play on real hardware. And for something that was done just for fun, it's some damn solid work all around. Of course, this praise is coming from a guy who hasn't even heard the original Bloody Roar 2 voices in the first place, but hey, what can you do? As for the actual game itself, I was genuinely surprised at how much fun I was having. I'm not just saying this because I have two close friends that are massive Bloody Roar fans, I promise. But despite, once again, being pretty terrible at the game, there was enough here for me to get comfortable with trying to learn the game and just have a good time. The Beast Mode mechanic that's integral to the Bloody Roar series adds such a unique layer of strategy to fights while also being visually really sick. The controls feel great, the game runs extremely well, and for once, the difficulty of the AI actually makes sense based on what was set in the options menu. There are a few more modes on offer, but since I only really played the arcade mode, it actually made my multiple runs of it pretty enjoyable for once. That unfortunately didn't help much when it came to trying to unlock Shen Long. As close as I was to winning a few times, I just simply wasn't good enough to pull it off in the end. While the stupid part of me feels that I'm not worthy to play something like Bloody Roar 2, trying out the redub was a lot of fun. So much so that I'm willing to actually find an original copy of the game at some point.
You
After waiting so long to get more info regarding IO Interactive's James Bond game, 2025 finally gave us our first look at 007 First Light. In order to pass the time until its release in May of 2026, provided it doesn't get hit with another delay, I played 3 more Bond games that I hadn't gotten around to yet. The one I was most excited to play out of the 3 going into them was 007 From Russia with Love.
Who are you?
The name is Bond. James Bond.
Finally sitting down and playing this one was, quite honestly, pretty weird at first. This mainly stems from being one of the very rare cases of me actually having seen the original film before ever playing the game. It's extremely silly in hindsight, but just seeing how bombastic the game was in comparison to the film threw me off pretty hard. Almost as if Bond using a jetpack in the game's opening mission wasn't a dead giveaway that this would be the case. That being said, I quickly readjusted my expectations and ended up enjoying what could best be described as a pretty solid James Bond game. The core third-person gameplay from EA's 007 Everything or Nothing was essentially retained here, though some new changes like the focus aiming makes a lot of the gunplay kind of a pushover. In fact, the focus mechanic led to one of the funniest boss fights I've had to deal with in a long while. The occasional driving levels that you'd come to expect out of a Bond game do their job of adding some fun variety to the action here as well. Having upgradable weapons and extra unlockable missions based on how many collectibles and level goals you got also gives a nice enough reason to replay past levels, though I found the secret levels themselves to not really be worth the effort. Bringing back Sean Connery to reprise his role as James Bond was always a cool aspect about this game. I would say he does a solid job, but since Connery obviously wasn't his younger self anymore when he recorded for this game, there is that bit of weirdness hearing his older voice come out of Bond. This ends up sticking out even more when you place his voice right next to, well, any other voiced character in the game.
Too bad. The game is over, Mr. Bond.
I think it's just begun.
Despite the numerous amount of liberties it took when compared to the film, EA Redwood Shores did a real good job with From Russia with Love. I do find that their work on Everything or Nothing is still stronger overall, but for what ended up being the last Bond game under Electronic Arts before Activision stole the rights, I feel that they ended on a pretty good note.
I look forward to it.
And for my next miracle?
Moving away from Sean Connery and into the Daniel Craig era, 007 Bloodstone was a game I had a fair bit of curiosity about for a few reasons. One, it's the only Craig-era Bond game that isn't tied to any pre-existing Bond film, and 2, it was the last game developed by Bizarre Creations, most notable for their Project Gotham Racing and Geometry Wars series. This one, unfortunately, ended up being pretty forgettable for me. It spends most of its time being a third-person cover shooter more than anything, and it plays fine for what it's worth. Sadly, any kind of special gadget use is all outside of combat and relegated to the smartphone, something I was never exactly a fan of during this particular era of Bond. The big gunplay crutch in Bloodstone is the focus aim system, which when filled via melee takedowns, allows up to 3 free kills whenever needed. It's pretty much a carbon copy of the Mark and Execute system from Splinter Cell Conviction, for those who may be familiar with that. The game does have its fair share of set-piece moments during its shooting segments, but the spectacle from the small number of driving levels was an honest highlight for me, which makes a lot of sense considering what the studio has made prior to Bloodstone. Now, if you had to ask me what the plot of the game was about, I wouldn't even be able to tell you without having to look it up. It's not confusing by any means, but a lot of it just boiled down to the typical Bond needs to find and stop the villain kind of story. It really did nothing for me. The only thing that caught me off guard was its ending, and that's because it didn't feel like an ending at all. Instead, it leaves us with a cliffhanger that will never be followed up on. Overall, I did find Bloodstone to be a slightly enjoyable, but average game. I wasn't going in with real high expectations or anything, but having heard that it was somewhat underrated by some folks, I couldn't help but be slightly disappointed by what I played. Still, I think it was completely unfair for Activision to go and kill off Bizarre Creations because of this game. Doesn't help that the game was also released on the same day as the GoldenEye remake. It almost feels like this game was just sent out to die. The last Bond game I ended up playing in 2025 was 007 Quantum of Solace, more specifically, the Eurocom-developed PlayStation 2 version. I opted for the PS2 version because of how different it was thanks to using the third-person perspective, unlike Treyarch who went with first-person on the 360 and PS3. Having not played any version prior to this one, as well as not having seen the movies it's based on, PS2 Quantum of Solace ended up being so dumb that I couldn't help but love it. Now, I did say movies and not movie, as the game features both Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace stitched together. Suffice to say, the game didn't exactly help me understand what the main plot was for either film, so once again, I was just tagging along for yet another Bond adventure. Quantum is, once again, another cover-based shooter, with all of the regenerating health and waist-high cover that you've come to expect. While the cover mechanics work well enough, its shooting is hampered by having a rather poor choice of crosshairs to aim with. The thing is though, unlike all the other Bond games I've talked about in this video, that's all there is outside of some very brief stealth sequences. You don't drive a single vehicle in this game, which is kinda crazy since cars are another staple of the James Bond franchise. Instead, Bond just gets around with either his combat role that covers an insane amount of ground, or his light jogging, which provides one of the funniest running animations I've seen in some time. While on that subject, I was not prepared for this game to make me laugh as much as I did during my playtime. One sequence of events during the chase in the construction yard, followed by a QuickTime event, caught me off guard so bad that I nearly fell on the floor in tears from how hard I was laughing. Holy shit. Wait, what? Why explode? Actually, no, let me fail this. Oh, it just resets? Okay, that makes it even better. Oh, it's not the same button every time. Oh, God. Another aspect of Quantum of Solace that surprised me was that it's a fairly solid-looking PS2 game, far better than I would have expected out of a last-gen version at the time. And while I can make fun of Bond's running animation all day, some of the cinematic melee takedowns look legitimately great. However, the game is extremely short, having only clocked in just over 3 hours to beat it. With no collectibles or even local multiplayer to speak of, there's really no reason to revisit this one after beating it. It's one of the biggest examples of a one-and-done game I could possibly think of. Yet, I can't help but look back fondly on the time I spent playing the PS2 version of Quantum of Solace, including all of its jank. It remains to be seen if I end up liking the 360/PS3 version over this one whenever I get around to playing it, but I honestly don't think it'll come close to making me laugh as hard as this one did. Yeah, he just dies on impact! He really does break his spine! I was joking about that when I succeeded it. But seeing it is so much wow. One more. I think it's safe for me to say that 2025 was a pretty challenging year for me. I'm probably not alone in this, but with the current state of everything, it's just been taking an honest toll on me. Thankfully, I was able to take the opportunity to go on a vacation to France for the second time in my life. Spending some quality time with my boyfriend for about 3.5 weeks was exactly what I needed to take my mind off everything. That's not to say I didn't do my fair share of gaming while I was out of the country. The convenience of the Nintendo Switch kept me occupied during some downtime, and I made sure to bring along a few games that I wanted to spend some more time with. And, as luck would have it, the release of Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition landed just mere days before my departure flight to France. I originally played all the way through Xenoblade Chronicles X on the Wii U back at the end of 2015, and it ended up being one of my favorite games released for the console. Being somewhat convinced that it was going to be trapped forever on that system, having it finally be ported to the Switch made me pretty happy. Since this was my second time ever starting Chronicles X from the beginning, I thought I was only going to spend maybe just a few hours playing it on vacation before tossing it into my backlog. Instead, the game had somehow once again got its hooks into me, and I ended up playing it nearly every day when I could. Aside from having some updated visuals for the Switch, Definitive Edition goes out of its way to fine-tune a lot of the rough edges from the Wii U version. More specifically, making a lot of the nuances of the battle system much easier to understand for anyone trying their hand at the game for the first time. Otherwise, the combat itself remains pretty much the same, if not a bit snappier than before, and is extremely fun once you get a hang of it all. Getting your first Skell, aka those giant mechs, still takes many hours of game time, but opens up a whole nother layer of combat to mess around with. Combine all of this with the game's soundtrack that I still can't tell if I like unironically or not after a whole decade, and I just couldn't pull myself away from this game again like with the Wii U version. And to make things even better, this version gives you up to 3 save slots instead of just having 1, which to me is one of the best additions they could have made to this game. Definitive Edition isn't just a simple port either, as it also adds brand new content that wasn't a part of the original release. The story of Chronicles X was never something I cared too deeply about, especially when stacked up against the first Xenoblade game. Regardless, having new story content was enticing enough for me to check it out all over again. However, aside from getting a few new party members and some new skills before then, the brand new major plotline doesn't happen until after the main story is complete. So for people already familiar with the original like myself, it takes a very long time to get to that point. Was it worth it? I'm not entirely sure about that. I will be avoiding spoilers here, as the new story still has its fair share of cool moments, but a good portion of it left me pretty confused by the end of it. I don't know if I missed crucial details or whatnot, or if me being behind on the franchise is keeping me in the dark, which is odd because X always felt pretty standalone from the rest of the series plot-wise, but I don't know. At the very least, the new epilogue is made easy to replay if you ever want to re-experience that part of the game again. Having finished the rest of Xenoblade Chronicles X after returning home from my vacation, I felt that replaying the game with this new version was well worth my time. Sure, the new story stuff may not have stuck with me like I had originally hoped, but the game itself was still far too addicting to put down. They even brought back the online component that eventually got shut down on the Wii U. For that and many other reasons, I think the Switch version more or less deserves its Definitive Edition moniker, and is by far my favorite remaster that was released in all of 2025.
Got it! Now take the shot and topple them!
One blow hit the all.
On a much smaller scale, Another Code Recollection was the other game that took a fair amount of my vacation downtime. This release serves as a remake of 2 different games, Another Code / Trace Memory on the Nintendo DS, and Another Code R on the Nintendo Wii, the latter of which originally never made its way to North America until this collection. And it was pretty okay, I guess. Before getting too deep, I do want to say that I really love the art style of this game. Both the character models and sketch-like artwork are really pleasing to look at. It's definitely one of the highlights of the whole game for me. Despite being labeled as a collection of sorts, the remake treats the 2 games as a single narrative, meaning there is no way to immediately skip to the second game if you wanted to. I can understand why they did this, since some characters and plot revelations do carry over a small bit between the 2, but having the option in general would have been nice. It's a good thing I kept a separate save for the start of Journey into Lost Memories, otherwise I would not have been able to capture my own footage for that part of the game. I also played a bit of this game together with my boyfriend. We ended up finishing the first game together while I wrapped up the second game on my own back home in the States. For those unfamiliar, these are both adventure games with a large focus on its mystery narrative, sometimes being broken up with the occasional set of puzzles from time to time. Both games have a fair bit of intrigue regarding the mysteries at the heart of their plots, but I don't know. Neither of them managed to keep me really invested the whole way through. There were quite a few moments where I honestly struggled to stay awake while playing, and that really sucks because I truly wanted to get into this game. I think the only time I was interested with where the story was going was about more than halfway through the second game, whereas the first one just kinda came and went. I also never found Ashley to be much of a compelling character to play as in either game, and while her attitude is fitting due to her being a teenager, there were times where I just could not stand her. It's possible that this might have been an unfortunate side effect of the rather subpar English voice acting, though there is an option for Japanese VO if you'd prefer.
Why isn't Dad here? He's the one who told me to come to this island, so where is he?
As for the multitude of puzzles you'll come across, most of them are pretty simple and easy to solve, with only a few that requires a bit more brain power. However, there was one puzzle in the first game that took me and my boyfriend way too long to get past. Not because it was difficult, but because the puzzle didn't actually work. Despite being confident that we had the right answer, the game kept saying we were wrong, so after about 20 minutes I looked up the solution, and it was the exact solution we already tried. So we tried it again, and only then did the game finally decide that we got it right. I have no idea if there was an event trigger or something we missed initially, but I was pretty pissed off for being right the whole time. I really wish I ended up liking this game more than I did. It is by no means a bad game, it just didn't do a whole lot for me. I don't know if my overall feelings towards Another Code is a result of how the remake handles things compared to the DS and Wii originals, but I'm not exactly willing to go find out at this time.
Oh, Lake Juliet, do-do-do-do. Do-do-do-do, Lake Juliet.
Huh. Yeah.
As a quick aside, I wanted to mention both RZ The Jewel of Faramore and the Turok 3 remaster. These are games I had already beaten and streamed prior to 2025, but I found myself finishing another playthrough of both while on my vacation. For RZ, the excellent CDI-inspired action-adventure game, I ended up clearing the game's hard mode, thankfully without forcing myself to use the CDI controller this time. It was shortly after finishing hard mode that I found out that the game has even more unlockable modes than I originally expected. It was honestly a neat surprise, but for now, I'd say I'm satisfied enough with the two main playthroughs I did. As for the Turok 3 remaster, thanks to the short runtime allowing me to finish a single playthrough in under 2 hours, I took the time to wrap up all of the in-game achievements on the Switch version. And I actually ended up doing the same exact thing for the PS5 version a few months prior to going to France. This basically means I ended up beating the Turok 3 remaster more times than I could count, regardless of version. But to its credit, Night Dive did a really good job on bringing Turok 3 out of the confines of the Nintendo 64, even if I still lament the exclusion of its multiplayer mode.
Warning. Collision in 30 seconds.
One highlight of my vacation was having my boyfriend try out the Nintendo 64 at his town's local gaming cafe. As this was an era that he missed out on growing up, having him play titles that I was already familiar with for the first time put a huge smile on my face. Since we both have Nintendo Switch Online, we decided to check out what was available on the Nintendo 64 app for us to play together once I got back home to the States. The one that ended up catching his attention the most was Pokemon Snap. For the record, my boyfriend is much more into Pokemon than I am. Yet Pokemon Snap was a game that I had pretty fond memories of back when my family rented it from Blockbuster during my childhood. It being his first time ever playing the game, I watched along to see how he'd react to all of the Pokemon wandering around each of the game's locations, and how said Pokemon would behave using the numerous unlockable tools in order to get the best photo. He got a real good kick out of what he played, though he did struggle with the controls due to the forced inverted aim and how the N64 controller prompts got him mixed up due to using the Switch's Joy-Cons. We eventually settled on having me be behind the controls for a majority of the game, swapping back and forth a few times after, just for fun. For as simple of a concept as it is, Pokemon Snap holds up really well. The addictive nature of the on-rails photography gameplay, coupled with its huge incentive for figuring out the game's secrets to progress, was always something that stood out to me. It could have been super bare bones, but it has a bit more depth than you'd initially expect, and it manages to be incredibly charming to boot. Since we were using the Switch Online app, Pokemon Snap happened to be one of the games with multiple language options. Because my boyfriend lives in France, we played the French release just for the hell of it, which meant that we always got to hear Professor Oak criticize our photos en français. The two of us had a real fun time playing Pokemon Snap together. It even convinced him to pick up the Switch sequel, New Pokemon Snap, though he has told me that his interest in that game dropped rather quickly. Oh well, can't win them all, I guess. I've recently found myself being much more open to playing older titles from my backlog than I would have in years past. A benefit of doing my live streams is that it has more often than not given me the motivation I needed to sit down and actually play these retro games. Having a ginormous, yet curated collection myself, it is both a blessing and a curse to have so many games to choose from. From games that I'm honestly a bit embarrassed about not having gotten to yet, to some that I don't think I would have ever seen myself playing all these years ago. The Karate Kid for the NES is one notable example of the latter category here. This was given to me a long while ago from a friend, despite me not having a working NES until many years after. I eventually did a grab bag stream near the end of 2024 where the Karate Kid was one of the games that was randomly selected. It was just as clunky as I was expecting it to be, thanks to already being well aware of this game's reputation. I unfortunately wasn't able to beat the game during that stream, but when my chat informed me that I was really close to the end on my final attempt, I decided that I was going to eventually come back and try again. Fast forward to a few months later in 2025, I was committed to beating the Karate Kid. And after about only 30 minutes into my live stream, I did exactly that. Then I went ahead and beat it a few more times for good measure. I have no idea what came over me, but the more I played the Karate Kid, the more I actually kind of enjoyed it. Mind you, I don't think this is a good game by any means. The awkward jumping controls and the ridiculous knockback every single time something hits you does make it a pain to play. Stage 3 in particular is especially egregious with this. But somehow, the levels of jank on display here made it kinda charming for me personally. Once I discovered how to manipulate the enemy spawns to where they would just tail you for the whole stage, a lot of the game became really easy to deal with. Well, every level outside of stage 3, that is. It may be a bit insane for me to say this, but the Karate Kid for NES ended up being a fun time. Again, is it a good game? No, I obviously wouldn't go that far, but I enjoyed it more than I could have ever anticipated. During that very same Karate Kid stream, I also booted up my NES copy of Die Hard. Right off the bat, this game was much more difficult for me to deal with compared to the Karate Kid. Frustrating combat and John McClane's stiff movement definitely did not help matters when trying to figure out how to proceed through the game. To its credit, the overall mechanics and structure of the game is its most interesting aspect, but it's just not executed well. As a result, I simply could not beat this game. I feel that I would need to have a proper game plan going into it before having another go at it someday. But that didn't stop me from checking out how speedrunners finished the game. Watching Arcus's world record speedrun in particular made me want to try and finish the game utilizing the tricks from his run. It did take me a few attempts to be able to understand the nuances and tricks used, but eventually, I managed to actually pull it off. Sure, I may not be setting any kind of new record, and this clearly isn't the intended way to beat Die Hard, but who cares? I finished the game and that's good enough for me. Maybe one day I'll come back to this game and try and finish it the quote-unquote normal way, but I don't see myself doing that anytime soon. I'd much rather go and finish yet another playthrough of the Karate Kid before even thinking about playing Die Hard again. Moving away from the NES, how about we spice things up with some Night Trap? Not just any version of Night Trap, mind you, but the version specifically made for the Game Boy Advance. Okay, so this one doesn't really count as a game I beat, since this isn't actually a playable version of Night Trap. Think of this more like those Game Boy Advance video cartridges more than an actual video game, as it compiles the numerous FMVs from the game and plays them out in order like a short film. It was made as an April Fool's joke back when limited run games put this up for pre-order, and I opted to order it since I just saw it as a fun novelty. Because this is running on the GBA, the FMV quality is about as crusty as you'd expect, but that's honestly part of the whole appeal of getting these to even fit on the cartridge. Though, for some odd reason, they opted to use the bad ending of the game for this release. I'm not really sure why they did this. Maybe they just ran out of space, or they're just trolling us because we're not actually playing Night Trap. In any case, it's still pretty impressive how much of the FMVs they were able to squeeze onto the Game Boy Advance. It may not be a version of Night Trap you can actually play, but maybe that's a good thing.
Wow.
Can you believe that it's taken me this long to actually sit down and beat Mega Man X? To clarify, I haven't legitimately beaten Mega Man X until 2025. I had originally played the game back when I was much younger via emulation, and during that time I had relied on excessive save state usage and cheat codes. Now, I can happily say that I finally played through the whole game from start to finish with 100% completion. And, unsurprisingly, it's really damn good. Great visuals, tight controls, and the highly memorable soundtrack makes Mega Man X worth playing even to this day. It may be a tad bit on the easy side compared to later installments, but I'd argue that helps make this game an excellent starting point for anyone wanting to get into the Mega Man X series. I'm honestly not sure what else I can say about this game that hasn't already been said many times before over the years, but that just goes to show that Mega Man X still holds up as one of the Super Nintendo's best games. There might be a good chance I'll be giving Mega Man X2 a shot in 2026, so look forward to that in the near future. As someone that didn't grow up with the PlayStation, the Twisted Metal series was never really on my radar. Despite this, a copy of Twisted Metal Small Brawl caught my attention at my local GameStop because it was one of the games in the franchise that I heard next to nothing about. The copy they had was surprisingly cheap compared to what it's currently going for online, so I said, why not, and decided to buy it and give it a fair shot. Unlike the rest of the series, Small Brawl serves as a spin-off that takes a more kid-friendly approach to its car combat formula. The cast of characters are now children using toy RC cars instead of being behind the wheel in a battle to the death. As for how the actual game plays, it's pretty alright. The vehicle handling controls are a little loose for my liking, but they get the job done. The combat and weapons are fun enough, but there were plenty of times where it was pretty difficult to line up some good shots. That being said, I didn't have too much trouble with the opponent difficulty, though there were a few sudden spikes here and there throughout the single player. One thing I will say though is that the final boss was kind of a drag. Having to play it safe so I didn't lose all my lives between each phase of the fight made it feel like it went on forever. It honestly got really boring really quickly. I'm well aware that there are much better Twisted Metal games than this one, but for being my first foray into the series, I had a decent enough time with Small Brawl. However, I don't see myself returning to this one to try the other characters anytime soon. I got my ending cutscene with Sweet Tooth, and I'd say that's good enough for me right now. While waiting for the inevitable release of Metroid Prime 4 at the end of 2025, I decided on a whim that I wanted to replay the original GameCube version of Metroid Prime on my live stream. Prior to this, I actually streamed all the other Prime games all the way back in 2024. I only skipped out on the first game due to already having streamed the incredible Switch remaster that released in 2023. I didn't necessarily need to do it, but I just couldn't resist the urge to do yet another playthrough, as Metroid Prime is one of my all-time favorite GameCube games, if not one of my favorite games ever made. Everything about Prime 1's design just hits all of the right notes for me. Decades later, I find that the original still holds up, translating the Metroid formula into 3D extremely well. The world of Talon 4 and its various locations are just so well thought out, beautiful, and fun to explore while seeing everything through Samus's eyes. Personal standouts like Phendrana Drifts and the Frigate crash site exude a level of atmosphere that elevates them to being such memorable locations. The incredible soundtrack does wonders to enhance the experience of playing through Metroid Prime, and is one that has stuck with me decades after its release. And as straightforward as the lock-on based combat is, it meshes perfectly well with the overall design of the game, with some solid boss fights for good measure. Sure, the endgame artifact hunting can be a little bit of a drag, but it's honestly not as bad as you might be led to believe, at least compared to every other Prime game after this one. If you're someone that has yet to experience Retro Studios' first attempt at a Metroid game, you should absolutely go out and do so in one way or another. Both the GameCube original and the Wii Trilogy releases are great ways to play Prime 1, with the aforementioned Switch remaster being a much more recent and all-around fantastic version as well. I just kinda wish that the remaster still had the unlockable fusion suit. That was kind of a bummer. One other game that I ended up doing a full replay of was the Xbox 360 version of Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary. I started doing sort of a yearly Christmas time tradition with the older Halo games, kicking off in 2024 with the first Halo on the original Xbox. Hell, I even used that giant Duke controller for the full 2001 experience. I had planned to play the 360 version of Anniversary right around the time I finished that Halo stream, so me playing this was in no way a response to that Halo Campaign Evolved remake that's being worked on, which, for the record, I'm not exactly looking forward to. Anyways, since Anniversary is at its core a graphical remake that released 10 years after the original Halo, the gameplay here is functionally identical. If you've played the first game before, then that's basically what you're gonna get here as well. You'll still be fighting the Covenant just like you remember, and you'll also be getting frustrated dealing with the Flood and numerous stray grenade explosions just like you remember. The brand new visuals have always been a bit of a point of contention with fans of the original, and while I don't exactly mind the updated graphics as a whole, I also can't help but be inclined to agree with the complaints. A lot of choices made with the updated art style don't work well in comparison to the original, with the biggest and most documented one being the level 343 Guilty Spark, where the atmosphere and complete tone shift compared to the levels that came before were totally lost with the remastered visuals. On the plus side, Anniversary's biggest and best feature is the ability to switch between the old and new graphics at any time. Only downside is, due to the limitations of the Xbox 360, it does take a couple of seconds to transition between graphics, though it is worth noting that the graphic switching is instant via the Master Chief Collection version of Anniversary. Now, as cool as this is, my 2024 replay of Halo on the Xbox made me notice that the old graphics on Anniversary had its own share of issues. The biggest one I noticed was how the fog was failing to properly hide the top edges of this area, something that worked as it should on the Xbox. I could go on, but numerous graphical gripes aside, Combat Evolved Anniversary is still a decent enough way to experience the first Halo. However, since the Master Chief Collection exists, there's no real reason to go out of your way to play the 360 version outside of genuine curiosity. But if you had to ask me, if you happen to have the means to do so, I feel that playing Halo on the original Xbox is still the definitive way to experience this game. In the meantime, I'll just wait for next Christmas season before I go back and replay Halo 2. To round off a few more games that I went back to replay in 2025, I had 3 games in particular I had yet to play its DLC for. The Final Fantasy XVI expansion pass was something I wanted to play, but was constantly holding off on buying until the price drop. It seriously felt like Square was trying its damn best to avoid putting it on sale, but after what felt like ages, that sale eventually happened and I picked it up immediately. The pass contains the Echoes of the Fallen and the Rising Tide expansions, both taking place right before the end of the game's main story.
It seems somebody's woken this place up. The question is, who?
Echoes of the Fallen is the shorter and more straightforward of the two, with Clive and company investigating a tower known as the Sage Spire in an effort to potentially find a hidden Mother Crystal. There's a little more to the plot involving a group of shady traders, but the large crux of this less than 3-hour DLC is fighting your way through this endgame dungeon. Outside of new equipment for Clive, enemies can now have shields that require a number of hits to break before they can be damaged. It's not much, but it does add an extra thing to be aware of in the heat of battle. So, if you're someone that enjoys 16's combat like myself, then guess what? It's a lot more combat. And while still on the subject, the highlight of the DLC is by far the boss fights. That final fight against Omega in particular was so good that it might just be worth the price of admission by itself. I can't think of many boss fights I played in 2025 that left me with my heart racing by the end of it. It's real good stuff. The Rising Tide, on the other hand, has a lot more going for it in terms of content. It's a tad bit longer than Echoes, has the new region of Mysidia to explore, even more equipment for Clive, and actually includes side quests alongside the story DLC. To briefly summarize, the story here revolves around Leviathan, the one icon that was mysteriously absent from the entirety of 16's main plot. Compared to Echoes, I did find the story here to be a bit more interesting. There was nothing wrong with the one in Echoes. It did have a few things going for it lore-wise, but everything revolving around Leviathan's dominant in the village of Mysidia in the Rising Tide was a little more compelling to me in the long run. One of the biggest features of this DLC is Clive having access to the brand new Leviathan abilities. This new set of moves is a ton of fun and fits in very nicely with the rest of Clive's arsenal. But I can't get over the fact that the main ability is by all accounts a shotgun that you have to reload. I don't know, something about having a super soaker shotgun of sorts in a Final Fantasy game is just extremely funny to me. Of course, I also can't forget about the final fight between Ifrit and Leviathan. While a pretty great boss battle in its own right, the absolutely insane DPS check halfway through was such an out-of-nowhere difficulty spike that I began to question what the hell the game even wanted from me. When I finally got past that part, I guess that the devs just wanted borderline perfection from the player. At least the remainder of the fight was much more manageable, and the song that kicks in, man, that alone almost made the struggle completely worth it. Almost. If there's one takeaway I had playing through both Echoes of the Fallen and The Rising Tide, it's that I remembered that I really liked and still like Final Fantasy XVI, and the expansion pass is basically more of what I already enjoyed about 16. While I still wouldn't have gotten this at full price, getting it on sale was totally worth it.
I have to go back.
In late 2025, we saw the release of Sucker Punch's follow-up to 2020's Ghost of Tsushima with Ghost of Yotei. Before even thinking about starting Yotei, I needed to make sure I went back to finally play through Tsushima's Iki Island expansion. I've had this DLC on my streaming docket for years now, just sitting there being neglected the whole time. I really don't know why it took me so damn long to get around to it, but I finally did it. And it's good! I think what ended up enticing me to get off my ass and play the DLC was the shorter than anticipated runtime. It was a good enough reason for me to get reacquainted with the game, though it took an embarrassing amount of time to relearn a lot of the important mechanics of combat, such as what sword stances were useful against certain enemy types. But after getting the hang of things again, everything I remember loving about the game came flooding right back. Just like Tsushima, the location of Iki Island is absolutely gorgeous, reinforcing how incredible the game looks even after all these years. Outside of the new story missions involving protagonist Jin Sakai traveling to the island to take on the Eagle Tribe and confront a bit more of his past, the rest of the DLC contains more of the usual side content you'd come to expect from Tsushima. The only new real additions to combat here are the shamans that make enemy Mongols much more aggressive and dangerous, and a new ability for your horse to trample down anyone standing in your way. Otherwise, it's more Ghost of Tsushima. It's very good, but it doesn't really do anything major to set itself apart from the main game. Nothing wrong with that, of course, as the new content does well enough to fit alongside the rest of the game as a whole. Considering that this expansion comes included with the director's cut version of the game, there's really no reason not to play it. Whether or not I actually end up playing Ghost of Yotei in 2026, I'm just happy knowing I can go into it with a clean slate now. I also wrapped up the last of the free Astrobot DLC levels, specifically the 10 new ones included with the Vicious Void update. As the name implies, these post-game levels are some of the more difficult that Astrobot has to offer. In reality, while the levels are indeed challenging due to the lack of checkpoints like in most of the prior DLC levels, they aren't exactly all that hard to beat, at least for me. The ones I had the most trouble with out of all of them was the one with the monkey climbing power-up, something I wasn't a huge fan of in the first place due to the motion controls, and the final unlockable challenge thanks to it being a rather long test of endurance more than anything. And just like before, your reward is a handful of new cameos to add to your giant army of Astrobots. For what it's worth, these levels are still fun, but just like most of the DLC that came before, it also isn't the strongest aspect of Astrobot as a whole. But hey, for the low price of free, I'm totally okay with everything that we got. I'd just rather see what Team Asobi is going to be working on next at this point. Before moving on, I wanted to give a very quick shout out to Deltarune Chapter 3 and 4. Since this game still has a way to go until it's fully finished, I'm going to avoid giving some more detailed thoughts until I play all the way through the final product. But what I will say though, is that Chapter 3 and 4 has some of the best moments in Deltarune up to this point, with Chapter 4 in particular being an incredible high point for me. If these two recent chapters are anything to go by, and with Chapter 5 just around the corner in 2026, I'm way more excited to see what'll be in store for what's to come. I would say I was happy with all of the expansions and DLC I played in 2025, but I would just be lying if I said that. One game in particular that I've spent many hours and years of my life on dropped a set of expansions in 2025 that made me question why I was even wasting my time. Buckle up, because I need an excuse to vent about Destiny 2 for the next couple of minutes. It's rare for me to lose as much faith in a game as I have with Destiny 2. After the final Shape expansion released in 2024, it was something that I would genuinely call good, providing a really solid send-off to the decade-long storyline that began all the way back in Destiny 1. Now, with Destiny 2 being an online-only live service game, Bungie tried to find ways to keep things going with some new storylines alongside its regular batch of seasonal content. This eventually led to the release of the first new expansion post-Final Shape, known as the Edge of Fate. To say that things went wrong once Edge of Fate released would be a gigantic understatement. I'd go as far as to say that everything that was added and changed thanks to the expansion was nothing short of a complete disaster. I do want to at least talk about some of the slightly more positive changes before I go off on a tangent about everything else. For one, the revamped armor and stat system is actually pretty good, allowing for a lot more build crafting opportunities and experimentation based on your preferred playstyle. And the story in the campaign revolving around the ever so mysterious Nine and newcomer Lodi manages to be at least a fair bit intriguing. Not the height of the Destiny storyline by any means, but I'd say it's serviceable enough here. In Bungie's own words, the campaign tries its hand at a Metroidvania approach this time around, slowly giving players new tools that allows them to get around the new Kepler destination and find secrets. It falls really flat in practice, as Kepler is a rather boring place to explore, and none of the new tools, including the rather annoying Matter Spark ability, really make this expansion super underwhelming. However, all of this pales in comparison to what kind of damage the addition of the Portal did to the game. This new feature was meant to help streamline the overall Destiny experience, letting players freely chase whatever kind of new and overhauled loot they'd want to grind. That sounds perfectly fine on the surface, but this had the side effect of basically making a large majority of pre-existing content for the game absolutely pointless. Seeing as the Portal only featured very specific activities that dropped loot that coincides with the new tiered loot system, nearly every old endgame raid and dungeon did not get its loot updated, which entirely killed any reason to go run them anymore. This was a completely boneheaded move, as for me personally, these raids and dungeons are far and away some of the best activities that Destiny 2 has to offer, and to just see them thrown out because of the portal was nothing short of infuriating. Sure, the new raid didn't have this issue, but I hadn't even bothered to run it since I never did the one from the final shape, and now that motivation is totally gone. And I don't even want to bother with the Crucible. This game's PvP hasn't been remotely fun for years. To make things even worse with the portal, it ended up turning the entirety of Destiny 2 into one giant slog of a grind. Since having a high light level is required to access the endgame content, the portal did serve as a means to raise said level in whatever way you wanted. Again, not bad giving players options, but the entire system was so poorly thought out that not only was raising light level far too slow, but the only efficient way to level grind was to replay the same exact solo ops mission over and over and over and over again. After I finished the Edge of Fate campaign, this was what the next few months of Destiny 2 looked like for me, and it wasn't fun. It was boring. Why do any other activity in the game if running Caldera was the fastest way to play the stuff I cared about? It was during this time where I simply asked myself, what am I even doing? The gameplay may still feel as good as it always has been, but I finally got to the point where it can no longer be Destiny 2's crutch. As someone that has persisted with the game even past the awful Curse of Osiris expansion all those years back, Edge of Fate honestly felt even worse by comparison. So much so that it was legit the closest I have ever come to outright quitting Destiny 2 and finally leaving it all behind. However, because I had bought both new expansions well ahead of time, I was at least going to see how the second one turned out before deciding on what I would do.
Start the engines. Take off as soon as you can.
Renegades, for what it's worth, does fare a little bit better. In no way does it completely redeem all of the bad decisions brought into the game from Edge of Fate, but it at the very least provides a decent amount of fun that, had the game not stooped to its lowest point, would have been pretty great. Renegade serves as an entire collaboration with Star Wars, bringing things like new weapons, yes, including lightsabers, into the world of Destiny. It's more of a cosmetic collab more than anything. There's no existing Star Wars lore that conflicts with the canon of Destiny or anything like that, so people super invested into that stuff have no need to freak out. Fans will definitely be pointing out numerous references and whatnot, especially during the new campaign centered around the Drifter and the new villain that comes off as great value Kylo Ren. The use of the Star Wars license is fun and all, but it comes off as a cheap crutch as well. To be fair, this expansion was planned well in advance before any of us even knew how Edge of Fate was going to turn out. But even then, it feels kind of like a break glass in case of emergency type of deal. While the campaign is serviceable, and the new Lawless Frontier activity is pretty fun, a lot of the core issues I've been having with Destiny 2 since Edge of Fate are still present here in Renegades. I still do not like how the portal is handled, but it has had its fair share of updates leading up to the expansion, making the grind far less awful while slowly adding in even more activities with updated loot. But again, all I ever found myself doing after finishing the campaign and playing a few other activities was mindlessly grinding again. All of these changes implemented to try and extend the life of Destiny 2 just resulted in me no longer caring anymore. It honestly hurts to see a game that I've spent so much of my life playing slowly lose what I loved about it. Since I have absolutely no interest in Marathon whatsoever, and depending on how 2026 is going to go for Destiny 2, it might be finally time for me to uninstall and move on. If I come back by the end of the new year still talking about Destiny 2, either the game made a miraculous comeback, or I lost control of my life.
Wait, there's a backlog. Keep moving, Guardian. I'm going to see if these transmissions can give us any more information.
It should come as no surprise that one of the most noteworthy moments for all of 2025 was the release of the Nintendo Switch 2. Despite the whole headache of the whole pre-order period being delayed here in North America due to real-world economic stupidity, I was still lucky enough to be able to get my pre-order in early. That didn't stop my Switch 2 from arriving about 1 week after its launch date, but hey, what matters is I got the thing, and I've been enjoying it quite a lot. It really does feel like a solid upgrade coming off of the Switch 1, and I even spent some time with the backwards compatibility just to see what games of mine ended up running better on Switch 2. When it came down to actually getting games for the thing, I primarily focused on the major first-party exclusives, as well as a couple of smaller downloadable titles. But for launch, there was no way I was going to skip out on Mario Kart World. Considering just how long the original Mario Kart 8 and its deluxe version has been out for, it feels great to finally have a brand new console Mario Kart to play, let alone as a launch title. And as it turns out, Mario Kart World delivers on being yet another enjoyable installment in the franchise. The kart racing gameplay you've come to expect is equally just as fun and extremely hectic as it has always been, now with some newly added techniques such as rail grinding and wall riding. It may not seem like much on the surface, and it honestly does take a small bit to get used to, but in the right hands, you can pull off some insane shortcuts with these new mechanics, something that I'm obviously nowhere close to being good enough to do. Just as the name implies, the large open world structure that is home to all of the new and returning courses is what sets Mario Kart World apart from the previous installments. It even goes the extra mile by having you travel from one course to the next, while still taking part in an actual race. I've seen people online grow to dislike this approach instead of just purely racing on the actual tracks themselves, but I personally didn't really mind them all that much. Sure, I totally understand the desire to just want to race on the main courses, especially since the ones in World are all great, but I feel that these in-betweens have enough going on in them to be fun in their own right. To World's credit, post-launch updates have allowed players to be able to do just that with friends if they so desire. And while the new Knockout Tour mode isn't really my thing, I've never been into any kind of mode that could be considered Battle Royale adjacent, it's a great addition that takes full advantage of the connected courses and the game's updated 24-player count. Driving around in the game's free roam mode may not be an entirely new idea for the racing genre, but Mario Kart's take on it does provide a decent amount of fun. What holds it back from being a truly great part of the game is that, honestly, there isn't really a whole lot going on in free roam. There are a large amount of P-switch challenges littered across the map to test your driving skills in various ways, as well as the collectible coins and panels, but since the main rewards are just stickers, that's pretty much all there is to it. That said, I kept finding myself coming back to free roam whenever I just wanted to unwind after a long day and explore as much of the map as I wanted to. Obviously, that doesn't excuse the lack of interesting activities in the mode itself, but sometimes it's just what I needed at any given moment, and I'm totally okay with that. Because at the end of the day, Mario Kart World was the kind of fun I was expecting and the kind of fun I ended up getting. The driving feels fantastic, the game looks great, the soundtrack is actually super good with so many incredible remixes, and as divisive as it may be, I found the interconnected nature of it all to be well executed. It's a really good Mario Kart game and a great launch title, but that $80 price point is still a really hard pill to swallow. It was technically cheaper if you opted for the bundle, but if you're someone who collects physical games like myself, it's really expensive for what you're getting here. But should you decide to take the financial plunge, there's a really fun game waiting for you here. Even though we had to wait about a month after the Switch 2 launch for Donkey Kong Bonanza, the extra wait ended up being totally worth it. I'll just get this out of the way immediately and say that Bonanza is far and away the best Switch 2 exclusive that released in all of 2025. I just couldn't put the game down once I got my copy and started playing. Being able to destroy a large amount of the world was something I found extremely addicting, and the amount of destruction on display is really impressive, even if it's clear that the Switch 2 has its moments of not being able to keep up with it all. What's even more impressive is that even with its focus on destruction, the actual level design of Bonanza remains excellent, with the game's numerous layers providing its fair share of fun mechanics to coincide with Donkey Kong's moveset and new Bonanza powers. It was even surprising to see that ideas I had in my head to try and reach certain areas earlier than intended actually ended up working. It's almost as if the devs accounted for certain players going the extra mile, which is always really cool to see. The control scheme did take a bit for me to get used to, since 3 of the 4 face buttons are based on the direction of DK's punches, but once everything clicked, it became one of the best feeling platformers I've played in a long while. Collecting every banana I came across by punching them to pieces always felt satisfying, even after like the 50th or even the 500th one. One thing that surprised me about Bonanza was that the game felt like it could just keep going. There were multiple points where it felt like I was reaching the end, only for there to be even more levels to run around and find more bananas in. It did risk going on for a bit too long for my liking, but thankfully I felt that the game wrapped up at just the right time, even going as far as to deliver one of the craziest finales that I ended up playing in all of 2025. If there was any point of the game where I did start to feel burnt out, it was getting the full 100% completion after finishing the game. Mind you, I'm glad I did it, since the game gives a good enough reason to play more after beating the game, but while getting all of the fossils, outfits, and bananas was fun enough, getting the rest of the optional bananas turned into a mindless grind fest. Honestly, if it wasn't for how catchy a lot of the Bonanza themes are alongside the rest of the game's great soundtrack, I don't think I would have had it in me to go all the way to 100%. Regardless, the amount of hours I spent playing Donkey Kong Bonanza was absolutely well worth it. As I mentioned before, I feel that it's currently the best overall exclusive that the Switch 2 has to offer. I'd even go as far as to say it's the best Nintendo-developed game that we've gotten in a hot minute. If you're someone who is planning to eventually pick up a Switch 2 down the road, Donkey Kong Bonanza should be at the very top of your list, unless you hate platformers or something like that. So, with all that being said, how does a company like Nintendo put out a game as good as Donkey Kong Bonanza, only to also release something like Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tour? This overly glorified tech demo and minigame collection honestly fails to even justify its relatively low $10 price point. Nearly all of the minigames on offer focus on the Switch 2 Joy-Con's new mouse mode, to the point that it's borderline overkill. Sure, some of them are a little bit of fun, but a lot of them require a ton of desk or table space to even do well, and other mouse-focused minigames are just far too annoying to have any fun with. Did that stop me from trying to get all the medals I could on some of these? No, but I did feel my brain slowly start to die with how many attempts some of these took. That damn swimming minigame owes me a new desk. What's worse is that some of the other minigames require you to buy extra peripherals like the Switch 2 camera. It's a very small portion of minigames, but being locked out of content just because you didn't pay $50 for a peripheral just flat out sucks. The other portion of Welcome Tour, the more informational side of the game, is admittedly kinda neat. Obviously it's not for everyone, but getting some tidbits about how some of the inner technical functions of the Switch 2 works was cool to learn about. But again, that begs the question, why wasn't this just a free pack-in with the Switch 2? There's really nothing here in Welcome Tour that makes it interesting or fun outside of maybe a few minutes of play at most. I spent about 5 hours seeing and playing everything I was able to in the game, and I honestly have no reason to ever want to come back after that. I would have cut this game a little bit of slack had it actually been a free download, but even for a price as low as $10, it's asking far too much for what it is. The only silver lining here for me was that since I got a free $50 eShop card due to my Switch 2 arriving late in the mail, I used some of those funds to cover the Welcome Tour cost, even though it would have been smarter to use them on pretty much anything else. Which is exactly what I did when it came to buying
Fast Fusion.
With Shinen's new entry in their Fast Racing series, Fusion takes advantage of the Switch 2's improved specs to deliver a good-looking and extremely fun futuristic racing game. The sense of speed that these games have been known for is as exhilarating as ever, and some slight alterations to existing mechanics, like giving racers the ability to manually jump instead of relying on jump pads, do enough to make this installment feel unique from their previous efforts. The big new addition is the ability to fuse two vehicles together in the shop to create a new machine with various upgraded stats. It's a cool idea that has the unfortunate side effect of being able to pin down what the objectively best machine in the game could be, which in turn made a lot of the races, regardless of cup difficulty, a lot easier to manage. The tracks on offer here are very fun and well thought out, but the overall soundtrack outside of a couple of songs here and there didn't really gel with me all that well during these races. While there is local multiplayer, one shocking omission with this game was the complete lack of traditional online play, something that the previous games had. The only thing close to online is the game taking advantage of the Switch 2's new game share feature. It's pretty cool, allowing friends to be able to play certain games together without them needing to own it, but for Fast Fusion, it's limited to 2 players only, so if anything, it comes across as far too limiting for its own good. Because of how much fun I was having with Fast Fusion, I also dug back into my Switch library and booted up obviously not a Switch 2 game, but if I was going to talk about this game anywhere, this was the best time for it. I only played a small amount of RMX years ago due to it being essentially an updated re-release of Fast Racing Neo from the Wii U, a game I had already spent a fair amount of time with before. But now, using Fast Fusion as a new point of comparison, I found myself having an equally great time with Fast RMX. The overall speed of this game is far faster than I had originally remembered, and for being a Switch/Wii U game, it still looks really good. I quickly got dragged into the thrill of it all over again, to the point where I ended up finishing every cup. Speaking of, RMX has a lot more racetracks compared to Fusion, though I guess that's a bit unfair due to this being an updated version of Fast Racing Neo. If anything, I found the various differences between this game and the newest one to be fascinating, as I enjoyed both games for what they each have to offer. Of course, futuristic racing is their common through line, and while their nuances with the game mechanics are different enough, both are handled excellently. If I was forced to pick one of these games over the other, honestly, I'd lean more towards Fast Fusion. For me, Fusion's game feel is my favorite overall, as I'm a fan of the manual jumps and how the boost meter works here versus RMX. Meanwhile, RMX has actual online play, a hefty amount of racetracks, and a somewhat stronger soundtrack over Fusion. It does sadly lack in various areas that Fast RMX excels at, but at the end of the day, Fast Fusion kept me coming back even though I wish there was just a little bit more. But regardless of all my comparisons here, both of these games are still absolutely worth playing if you're craving that kind of F-Zero or Wipeout style of racing game. You're gonna be so much better off buying these games off of the eShop versus spending any money on Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tour, that's for sure.
You reached first place!
Tired of me talking about racing games on the Switch 2 yet? Well, that's too bad, because Kirby Air Riders is definitely worthy of your attention. Now, I'm someone who missed out on the original Air Ride back on the GameCube, so I never got to see why it has the fan following that it does. But if Air Riders is any indication, I think I finally understand exactly why that is. It's just some good old chaotic fun. The extremely simple nature of the controls makes it really easy to get into Air Riders, but once you add in all of the power-ups, selectable machines, and characters with their various stats, that extra bit of depth to the racing gradually reveals itself. So much can happen in any given race, to the point where it all tends to wrap up before you even realize it. Yet the fast nature of these races never really became a problem for me. Both the Air Ride and Top Ride modes are still plenty fun in that small amount of time, and I was always eager enough to hop into another track to do it all over again. In addition, the amount of customization in Air Riders does allow you to make races as short or as long as you'd like, which is something I will always appreciate. I did end up spending most of my time playing Road Trip, which serves as the game's single-player story mode. It's basically a collection of challenges featuring the various game modes in Air Riders, allowing you to pick and choose which ones to attempt on any given run. It even has multiple branching paths, leading to things like new unlockable machines, and encountering various other events and boss fights. Road Trip actually has a fair amount of replay value, with a single run lasting a bit longer than I was originally expecting, even going as far as rewarding players who managed to unlock all the vehicles in the New Game Plus run. But if there is one thing I feel obligated to talk about regarding Air Riders, it's the City Trial mode, making its return from the original with a whole new map. I've always heard that City Trial was the reason to play Air Riders with friends back in the day, so seeing as the mode in this game is my first go at it, all I can say is that it's well, it's kind of insane. Since the main focus is to power up your stats and hang on to your machine of choice, you might end up finding yourself zooming across the map at uncontrollable speeds, dealing with the random map events, and have numerous power-ups go off all around you, whether they're from other players or yourself. All for it to result in a random stadium event where you can either easily win or lose super hard based on what you entered with. The amount of stuff happening on screen during any given moment in City Trial can be a lot, to the point where it can just be nothing but a total sensory overload. I'll be honest, it's not my preferred mode of play in Air Riders, but to its credit, the absolute chaotic nature of City Trial makes it wholly unique and remains an important part of the overall experience. It's something that shouldn't really be taken seriously due to the hectic nature of it all, and if you go into it with a more casual mindset, you'll probably have a blast. At the end of the day, Kirby Air Riders ended up being one of the most fun games I played on my Switch 2 all year. Something that became even more apparent to me after playing with friends, and even a few relatives of mine during Christmas time. Masahiro Sakurai's presentation and game design sensibilities are on full display here, and if a racing game like Mario Kart World didn't end up doing anything for you, then I would say that Air Riders is a great alternative. That just leaves us with the long-awaited and rather divisive Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. For a game that went through such a lengthy and rocky development as this one, I actually came out of Prime 4 mostly enjoying the time I spent with it, albeit with some very notable caveats. Having only played the Switch 2 edition of a game that is a Switch 1 title at its core, the visuals here look absolutely stunning. Coupled with the great art direction throughout the game's various areas, and Prime 4 is an easy contender for the best looking Switch 2 game at this current moment. The excellent soundtrack composed by Kenji Yamamoto and Minako Hamano was also another highlight for me, and very much worthy of being in a Metroid game. Songs like the main themes for Fury Green and Volt Forge complement their locations beautifully, and they haven't left my brain ever since I heard them in full for the very first time, which is definitely a step up from Metroid Dread's rather forgettable soundtrack in my opinion. As for the gameplay, it very much keeps its identity as a Metroid Prime game, complete with its lock-on based combat and exploration. Controlling Samus both in and out of combat feels great here, and the way they re-implemented the lock-on free aim from Prime 3 by using either the right analog stick or gyro aiming was a smart way to keep said mechanic. While I do feel that the enemy variety isn't that strong for the game's combat, the boss fights in general are great and definitely one of the game's strongest aspects. Everything I've described about Metroid Prime 4 so far has shown me that Retro Studios is still totally capable of handling the Prime series, despite being away from it for so many years. However, those caveats I alluded to earlier unfortunately drags Prime 4 down a bit more than I would have hoped. The whole gimmick of the psychic abilities that Samus obtains throughout the game feels rather hollow and lacking in any interesting ideas. Things like the control beam where you can move your shot freely, the ability to pick up and throw morph ball bombs, and the new slingshot anchors for the spider ball are cool and all, but everything else is just the same set of abilities we've had before, just with a psychic moniker slapped onto it. It's a shame that they didn't take more risks with what Samus can do in this regard. While the new Viola motorcycle that Samus obtains during the game feels great to drive around in, it barely gets any unique use outside of some very rare moments. The rest of the time, you'll be driving around the large, barren, and dull desert of Soul Valley, which serves as the main connecting point for all of the locations on planet Viros. Having to always come back to Soul Valley to go to another area made me miss the times where the world felt more interconnected with each other like in the first two Prime games. I get that they wanted to get a lot of use out of the shiny new motorcycle, which again, I do like, but I don't think this was the correct way to go about it. While there are some small shrines placed around for weapon upgrades and the like, and the odd enemy can show up while driving around for vehicle combat, it's not enough to make this giant open area not feel like a complete chore. It also doesn't help that you'll be spending a majority of the time driving around Soul Valley collecting green crystals, and you need to collect a large amount before you can actually finish the game. I was warned well ahead of time about the whole crystal fiasco, so it didn't end up bothering me that much compared to people who found out the hard way. In fact, those giant rocks you can only destroy late in the game are all you really need to be able to move on. But even I can acknowledge that this is not a great alternative to the key hunts from the previous Prime games. Then, there's the Galactic Federation troops. Honestly, even though I would have preferred Prime 4 to be another solo Samus adventure, these characters never really bothered me all that much. There are a fair amount of moments where you have to be with them during gameplay, but thankfully none of these instances outstay their welcome. That being said, I do have to bring up everybody's favorite punching bag, Miles McKenzie. Sure, he does not make a good first impression, or second, or third, but against all odds, I merely tolerated him most of the time. That is, until I realized that he takes over the role of the game's hint system. Now, previous Prime games have had optional hint systems where Samus' ship would highlight a room on the world map to nudge the player in the right direction if they got lost. In Prime 4, Miles does that with his usual style of dialogue, so there's nothing wrong with that on its own. The problem is that Miles drops hints on where to go constantly, probably more than in any past Prime game. Anytime I was just going around looking for items and upgrades despite already knowing where to go, he would always chime in to remind me what I had to do, and there's no way to turn this off. To make matters worse, the game features a button on the map screen where you can call Miles, clearly meant for anyone who truly got lost and needed a refresher on where to go next. But why even have this option if Miles just decides to call you anyways without asking? It just comes off as the game having a complete lack of trust in the player. Now, all of my various gripes aside, I still came out of Metroid Prime 4 mostly satisfied. I went as far as to get 100% completion, then go for it all over again on hard mode. It may not have fully lived up to some of my expectations, most games with development trouble rarely do, but I got myself a pretty good new Metroid Prime game. I know that there will be people out there that will disagree, but out of all of the Retro Studio developed Metroid Prime games, I'd say that 4 sits comfortably as my third favorite in the series, just above Prime 3. Though it's more of a distant third place when compared to both Prime 1 and 2, the former still being my absolute favorite Metroid Prime game to this day. And no, this isn't a recency bias sort of thing. Having gone back and played every Metroid Prime game within the past year or so leading up to Beyond, all of these games are still fresh in my mind, so I'm fairly confident with my assessment. I just hope that Retro looks back at this game and avoids repeating these numerous missteps if they're given the opportunity to work on a 5th Metroid Prime game. The Switch 2 is great and all, but that actually wasn't the only console I ended up buying in 2025. I finally decided that this was the year I was going to bring myself home a Sega Saturn. While the Saturn isn't a new console by any means, it is more or less new to me, and one that I kind of wish I ended up getting much earlier than I did. I was lucky to find one during Retro World Expo 2025, and I made sure to take home a couple of Saturn games from the convention as well. Despite what I had already mentioned earlier about my gigantic lack of skill in fighting games, when I saw a copy of Fighters Megamix at Retro World, I knew I had to have it. And surprisingly enough, I had a lot more fun with it than I was originally anticipating. What is essentially a mashup between Sega's own Virtua Fighter and Fighting Viper series, this 3D fighter plays great and runs really well on the Saturn. Now, I'm not even close to being just decent at this game by any means. I can't even do simple combo strings without feeling like I'm just mashing buttons. But I can personally give Fighters Megamix credit by having a lower AI difficulty setting that actually feels like it should, unlike certain other fighting games of the era. One notable feature of this game that I've always heard about secondhand from one of my friends was the unlockable fighters. And yeah, a lot of them are really silly, but that just makes me appreciate the game even more for not taking itself too seriously. I still have quite a few characters I need to unlock in Fighters Megamix, like the Daytona USA car, but I really enjoyed my time playing this one. For Saturn owners, it's an easy recommendation for me. The original Panzer Dragoon was the only other Saturn game I bought alongside the system during Retro World Expo. Team Andromeda's beloved rail shooter was always on my radar when it came to the Saturn library, and it was a real treat finally being able to play it through from start to finish. Throw in an excellent orchestral soundtrack to accompany the action, and you've got yourself one of the most fun and memorable games that I've played this year. I heard some offhand comments going into Panzer Dragoon saying that this game was pretty tough. While the game does have limited continues to offset its relatively short playtime, you do get extra continues if you destroy enough enemies in the stage. My first run was on the normal difficulty, and I finished it without too much trouble until the final few stages. Once I finished that, I immediately went into hard mode, expecting to not even come close to beating it. It definitely was more difficult thanks to the increased damage, and the final boss getting an extra phase surely didn't help matters either. But surprisingly, I managed to finish it during the same evening on my very first attempt, using what continues I had on hand, of course. I guess the game is actually not as difficult as I was originally led to believe. That, or I just got lucky. Who knows? After finishing Panzer Dragoon, I was eager to dive right into its sequel, Panzer Dragoon Zwei, as soon as I could. A few weeks later, despite it being a bit expensive, I went ahead and snagged a good-looking copy off of eBay. And you know, I don't regret it one bit, because this game is such an incredible step up from the original. Serving as a prequel to the first game, Zwei builds upon its rail shooting gameplay with some neat mechanics that adds a bit of variety to the experience. Gone is the typical method of difficulty selection, and in its place are alternate routes that you can take throughout a majority of the game's 7 stages. Some paths are a bit more challenging than others, both in enemy density and in certain cases, finding out where some of the later path splits even occur. One other major change with Zwei is that there are now infinite continues, as well as the ability to save in the middle of a playthrough after getting a game over. This does make it an easier game than the first, and while this game does have its moments of sudden difficulty spikes in the late game, the danger of having to start the entire game over from the start has been totally done away with. If you ask me, I personally think this was the right call considering Team Andromeda's new approach with this game's structure. Alongside your dragon's new berserk meter that unleashes a devastating barrage of lasers, your dragon can also evolve throughout the game. The end of every level earns you growth points, which are determined by finishing said level, the route you took, and the total number of enemies destroyed. Based on your total points, it's very possible to have a completely different dragon by the end of each playthrough, which really adds to the game's replayability. And that's not even mentioning the unlockable Pandora's Box feature, which gives you even more fun options to mess around with. I had a blast with Panzer Dragoon Zwei, and while I personally prefer it compared to the first game overall, I should stress that the original Panzer Dragoon is 100% worth playing as well. The music, the one-of-a-kind art style, and the rock-solid gameplay make both of these games a real treat on the Saturn. I guess this means I'm officially a fan of the Panzer Dragoon series now, and I'm absolutely looking forward to checking out the rest of the games like Panzer Dragoon Saga whenever I actually get around to it. That does bring me to the unfortunate roadblock with the Sega Saturn. If you're even remotely familiar with the North American side of things when it comes to this console, then you're probably well aware that collecting games for it is borderline prohibitive. Sure, there are plenty of Sega Saturn games that are still totally affordable, but as I already proved with Panzer Dragoon Zwei, a lot of notable and highly sought-after titles range from expensive to outright unobtainable to anyone without disposable income. While I will always prefer owning my own physical copy whenever I can, there's just way too many Saturn games that I'm interested in that are simply out of reach. Now, I was well aware of this caveat for years before I decided to go and buy my own Saturn. Thankfully, nowadays there are plenty of alternative methods to play these games while still utilizing official Saturn hardware. Out of all of the ODE, or optical drive emulator options currently out there for the Saturn, I personally went for the Satiator. The biggest selling point for me when it came to the Satiator was the plug-and-play nature of the device, fitting right inside the rear video CD port without any internal modding needed. This ODE allows me to play about 99% of the Saturn's entire game library across all regions. While it didn't come cheap at around $200 when I bought it, not counting the SD card I needed for it to even operate, it was honestly a no-brainer for me. I mean, look at it this way. Getting the Satiator was far more affordable than buying a single complete-in-box copy of either Panzer Dragoon Saga or Magic Knight Ray Earth. The Japan-exclusive Saturn version of Dracula X Nocturne in the Moonlight, otherwise known as Castlevania Symphony of the Night, was high on my list of games to check out with the Satiator. I played this one on my own time since I had already streamed the original PlayStation version back in 2024, and I had always been curious about this port thanks to all of the exclusive features that stayed on the Saturn. Stuff like new areas and enemies, new weapons, a sound test with some classic remixes, and being able to select alternate characters from the start, including Maria. She was made playable in later ports of Symphony, but her playstyle in the Saturn version is drastically different. It's really cool, but also very tricky to get a hang of. But in the right hands, she can basically decimate anything. As for the two new areas, they're cool, but they are also not that long, and only one of them has a boss fight. I do like all of this stuff in the Saturn version, but it's a bit more underwhelming than I would have liked outside of Maria. I should also mention that I played with the Ultimate Edition fan patch for this game. This patch helps alleviate a number of shortcomings that plagued the Saturn port, such as improving certain graphical effects and increasing the general performance, with the added bonus of translating the text into English. Just for fun, I kept going back and forth between the original ROM and the patched version so I could experience both, with my saves thankfully working between the two. Now, while the Saturn port does pale in comparison to the PlayStation version, even with the Ultimate Edition patch, it's still Symphony of the Night. The flaws with the port never really bothered me, and the game managed to sink its teeth into me for yet another full playthrough. I think that says more about the enduring quality of Symphony as a video game more than anything, but I do think fans should at least give the Saturn version a fair shake, even if it isn't the ideal version. Changing things up, I also played through the first Virtua Cop. As someone who never played any of the Virtua Cop games, Sega's home console port ended up being mostly enjoyable. Simple and fun light gun action was sadly held back for me due to one big issue. Because I currently don't own a Saturn light gun for the intended experience, playing this game with a controller sucks. The way Virtua Cop pans the camera towards the enemies has the side effect of making it much more difficult to consistently line the crosshair up, leading to many frustrating misses. There were also instances where it felt like reloading my gun was straight up not working, but as I soon found out while playing, reloading requires you to double tap the button. I had thought my controller was acting up, but nope, it was just a design choice they made for some dumb reason. Out of curiosity, I did mess with the sequel very briefly, and thankfully they rectified this by making reload require only one button press. I do feel like I would have enjoyed Virtua Cop a lot more if I had an actual light gun to play it with. If I can find one that still works well enough, then I'll definitely be giving this one another go.
I'll go off what you want to know about a racket.
Now then, how about we wrap this segment up with some old-fashioned
Sega Rally Championship.
Right off the bat, I want to say that this game is just straight up excellent. Rally racing in general isn't something I really care for, but I got a kick out of this game the moment I got behind the wheel, so to speak. The cars have a very satisfying feeling of weight and handling to them, which makes taking turns feel so damn good. And that's not even including the car tuning options, which I honestly didn't even know this game had until I had already finished a full arcade run. Speaking of arcade, this being an arcade port means that the game is really short. There's only 3 racetracks total, with an extra being unlocked when you finish first in the championship, so there isn't too much here outside of time attack and 2-player battle. Still, Sega Rally Championship is a ton of fun with a great soundtrack to accompany it. I'm gonna make sure to find a physical copy down the road, since this is still one of the more affordable Saturn games as of making this video.
Easy left. Finish!
Anytime October comes around on my live stream, I always select a handful of horror-themed games to play throughout the month. These Spooktober streams are just a fun little way to get in the mood for Halloween, regardless of me having already played these games before or not. This year, I was able to finish all 5 of the games I picked out for the month. But before we get into all of those, there was one very appropriate game that I ended up playing on my own right before October fully kicked off. Cultic, the retro-styled FPS, or boomer shooter if you prefer, that originally released its first chapter all the way back in 2022, dropped its second and final chapter in 2025. I had originally bought Cultic a year after it came out, but it ended up just sitting unplayed in my Steam library for the longest time. With Chapter 2 out, I decided that if I was going to go and buy that, I needed to make sure that I was going to actually sit down and play through both chapters from start to finish. So I booted Cultic up one night and, man, let me tell you, the game managed to get its hooks into me so deep that I played all the way to the end of Chapter 1 the same night I started. With how good Cultic's gunplay and movement feels, I just didn't want to put the thing down. The solid weapon variety with its upgrade system and satisfying ways to dispatch enemies made me feel right at home with my love of the genre thanks to how much carnage I was dishing out. The voxel-based visuals combined with the striking choice of colors adds a lot to the game's horror theme, and it just oozes atmosphere so much that I couldn't help but be immersed during my playtime. Cultic's first chapter was so much fun that I kind of felt bad that I didn't play through it earlier than I did. So with Chapter 1 done and dusted, I went ahead and waited until the following night to dive straight into Chapter 2. And I'm not happy to say this, but it just didn't end up hitting the same way for me. It's still very good for what it is, maintaining the excellent gameplay and visuals as before. It's also a bit longer than Chapter 1, allowing for more ample time to land some crunchy headshots. What really dragged my enjoyment down for Chapter 2 was its level design. There were so many maps in this chapter where I ended up getting really lost, and since most levels are so long now, it really made my aimless wandering that much worse. I should note that the game has added an auto-map feature in one of its more recent updates, but no such feature existed back when I finished all of Chapter 2, so I unfortunately couldn't fall back on that for help. It's a shame too, cause despite how lost I got, it has some of my favorite locations in the whole game. The standouts for me in particular were the mall level, the Renaissance Fair, and the mansion, which with me being a fan of Resident Evil, I seriously got a kick out of. I just wish I had a better time actually getting through all of these levels. It got to a point where, unlike Chapter 1, I started to feel pretty drained by the time the game was wrapping things up. Still, I walked away from Cultic having some of the most fun I've had in 2025. I'd go as far as to say that out of all of the FPS games I played this year, it is far and away the best one. Sure, Chapter 2 may have been a small letdown for me compared to Chapter 1, but the entire package was absolutely worth my time. Anyone who has somehow stuck with this channel since the olden days of YouTube should already be somewhat familiar with Geist. Back in the day, Geist was one of my very first Let's Plays, and one of the few times I did a game review. And before you ask, no, none of those videos are worth watching today in any capacity. They've aged so poorly that I'm honestly pretty embarrassed by them in retrospect. I only bring this up as this was the first time I had revisited Geist since I did those videos all those years ago. The crazy thing is, my feelings on this GameCube exclusive first-person shooter have gone up a relatively small amount over time. The stiff aiming controls are still my biggest gripe with this game after all of these years, making gunfights feel a lot more jank than it should. It's at the very least offset by the rather dumb enemy AI, making most encounters easy enough to deal with alongside the numerous boss fights throughout. The game's main gimmick of being able to possess other living beings and inanimate objects is still a novel one, if not limited in its scope. The puzzle-like element of scaring someone so you can possess them is fun and a bit silly in its own right, and the methods of doing so are unique enough to keep them interesting. Geist manages to be pretty well paced throughout its roughly 6-hour runtime, though it has a small bit of slightly dull or annoying moments. I was not a fan of having to deal with the endless late game red ghosts that can take control of your body. The amount of times I had to mash the A button to escape got to the point where I felt like I was dealing long-term damage to my controller. For being an unfortunate victim of development hell, I think that Geist is still a competent enough game. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's a hidden gem by any means, but there's enough fun to be had here that it's at least worth a playthrough despite its inherent jank. It even comes with 4-player split-screen multiplayer with bot support. And for the record, any game with multiplayer where you can fight against bots gets extra kudos from me. Crow Country was originally on my Spooktober docket for 2024, but it was unfortunately skipped for one reason or another. This time around, it made the cut, and it turned out to be one hell of a good survival horror game. The visual design of the environments are very evocative of the style of pre-rendered backgrounds you'd find on a PS1 game. Except this is not a game with fixed camera angles, so the backgrounds here are entirely in 3D. I have no idea how they pulled this effect off, but the result looks absolutely incredible. Being a survival horror game, you'll be wandering around the titular Crow Country searching for key items to progress and encountering grotesque creatures along the way. Combat, in all honesty, doesn't feel great. The aiming feels rather awkward, and the way the camera is angled throughout the game made lining up shots far too annoying, even more so since the game makes shots do more damage based on how close an enemy is. Thankfully, the tried and true method of avoiding enemies to conserve ammo is still a viable option here, and one that I kept using as much as I could. The game also has a small trick up its sleeve, with various traps being placed randomly throughout the park. So much so that the placement of them can be different as soon as you change screens. The amount of times a freaking chandelier ended up falling on my head was too much to count. On the plus side, traps can also be used on enemies to great effect, though you'll have to shoot them with proper timing in order to reap the benefits. Most of the various puzzles throughout Crow Country are quite good, though there are a select few that kinda suck. These ones got to the point where, despite looking up the solution after getting completely stumped on them, the solutions themselves did not make any sense. The mushroom and the train puzzles are the ones that come to mind here. Thankfully, neither of them are tied to game progression and only provide optional rewards, so it didn't ruin my enjoyment of the game. And the overall plot involving police officer Mara Forrest, our protagonist, had enough going on here to keep things interesting by the end. Top it off with earning unlockables based on your ending rank, and there's enough reason to go and do multiple playthroughs. It's somewhat of a short game, but since there are many good survival horror games that only last a few hours, Crow Country fits nicely right alongside them. Faith, the Unholy Trinity was by far the biggest highlight for this year's Spooktober streams. Having played the Switch version, which includes all 3 chapters of the game, I was left with one of the most memorable horror games that I've played in quite some time. Chapter 1 was fairly straightforward and pretty short, with multiple endings providing a small bit of replayability. Chapters 2 and 3, on the other hand, are the real stars of the package, and are when Faith truly comes into its own. The Atari-like visual style combined with its use of rotoscoping for key moments are excellent, and the lo-fi audio does wonders for the tone and atmosphere. Playing with headphones, there were areas that were genuinely intense with how outright unsettling the background noise was. The audio and visuals managed to also add a small level of humor to the game, with the use of text-to-speech for the voices being a key part of that. It takes a special game like this to have me both genuinely laugh at points, only for me to get real tense not long after. The game does have its fair share of cheap jump scares, but since a lot of its best horror moments don't solely rely on that, I'm willing to let it slide here. Faith absolutely feels like Airdorf's passion project, and it's one I think he pulled off extremely well. Seeing how his ideas for the game grew as each chapter went on was great, and I left very satisfied with the experience. This one comes highly recommended from me.
Open fire.
Having revisited the Dead Space series over the past few years over on my live stream, 2025 was the year I ended up finally replaying the third mainline installment. I would have gotten to it much sooner, but since the game is fully playable in co-op, I opted to wait for my friend Blonde Guy Gamer to catch up with me on the series so we could both stream it together. We ended up playing via the Xbox Series X backwards compatibility with its FPS boost feature turned on. It was really impressive seeing the Xbox 360 version, which originally ran at 30 FPS, running at 60 frames with minimal issues from what we can tell. But, look, I never thought very highly of this game back when I first played it. I didn't outright hate it or anything, but even when playing solo or in co-op, it never held a candle to either of the first two Dead Space games for me. Seeing as it had been a long time since I last played Dead Space 3, I was hoping that this revisit would result in me having an overall better time with it. Yet, no matter how hard I tried, the game kept getting on my nerves to the point where I just struggled to have any kind of fun with it. The sort of bad omen with my Xbox Live subscription not working at first despite paying for it definitely did not help. Though to be fair, this was not the fault of the game, it was purely a Microsoft problem. A lot of my issues with Dead Space 3 stems from all of the various changes made from the previous two installments. The most obvious one that the game throws at you within the first 30 minutes or so is doing cover-based shooting against human enemies. Sure, Dead Space has had its fair share of action moments, even more so in Dead Space 2, but these games are still meant to be part survival horror. But in 3, the scale tilts way too far into the action territory, and it just feels so sloppy whenever these kinds of moments happen. Using Isaac Clarke's knowledge as an engineer, the newly introduced crafting system tries to help justify the survival horror angle, where any kind of scrap or components found in the game are used to craft health and ammo, or more importantly, new weapons. While it is neat to be able to craft whatever combination of weapon types you'd like to support a certain playstyle, this unfortunately removes any sense of identity with the overall arsenal compared to the previous games. This is made worse with the decision to make all ammo universal, no matter what type of weapon you're using. It may have been done as an attempt to reduce inventory clutter, but that ended up not changing anything, as more often than not, both Blondie and I were constantly drowning in ammo. The dismemberment-based gameplay that's a key part to the series is still here, but with the new weapon system and what you can create, it feels even less essential than ever before. And I don't know if this was a result of playing co-op online or not, but as the game progressed, the combat felt like it was just getting worse. Even keeping up with things like damage upgrades and the like made the constant encounters feel tedious and just not fun, which really frustrated me since this was a series that has always had great feeling gameplay. As for the story in Dead Space 3, well, the less that's said about it, the better. I wasn't much of a fan of the direction the story ended up taking back when I first played it, and my feelings definitely did not change this time around. It does what it can to try and wrap up the trilogy, but the journey to get to that point just felt sloppy. The whole love triangle subplot involving Isaac, his ex-girlfriend Ellie, who was introduced in Dead Space 2, and new character Norton was so stupid that I couldn't help but groan any time a moment related to it came up. In regards to the game's co-op, it comes across as feeling like it was tacked on as a corporate mandate from EA. For this playthrough, I opted to play as Carver, who in single player amounts to being pretty unimportant, whereas in co-op he also amounts to being pretty unimportant. Okay, to be fair, he does occasionally chat with Isaac in co-op, and we do learn a little bit more about him and his past through one of the later side missions, which is one of the very rare moments where playing co-op provides a unique experience. It's a shame, the game's co-op could have used more moments like this, but instead we're just left with something that was just thrown together to help boost sales. While this was not my first rodeo with Dead Space 3 by any means, this revisit gave me a good excuse to finally play the Awakening DLC that released sometime after the game's release. Blondie himself had already played the DLC before, but for me, I was more or less going into this one completely blind. And boy, did it end up being a complete waste of my time. It serves as an epilogue to the story, but the main crux of the DLC's gameplay involves backtracking through multiple areas that we both went through already to try and get off planet. It's really short, only taking about an hour and a half to finish, and outside of one boss fight, there really isn't anything interesting going on here to talk about. That is, except for the ending. To say I wasn't happy with how Dead Space 3, and as it stands, the entire franchise concludes, would be putting it very lightly.
Yeah, it hard cuts from that. So yeah,
I think Coolsville sucks. I think Coolsville sucks. I think Coolsville sucks.
I really wish I could have enjoyed Dead Space 3 a lot more this time around. Believe me. I tried so hard to give it the benefit of the doubt, but it always felt like the game had other plans in mind. Playing co-op with Blondie did have its moments, but even something like that wasn't enough to prevent this from being one of the least fun experiences I've had all year. Yet, I wouldn't go as far as to call Dead Space 3 an awful video game or anything like that, as I would still play this over Dead Space Ignition. It was just an unfortunate victim of corporate compromise, which is a fate that this franchise never deserved.
Good timing.
I remember that a lot, so I was ready for it. If there was one game during Spooktober that I went into with a large amount of uncertainty, it was undoubtedly Silent Hill F. Given how long it's been since the last new full-length entry in the series, not counting Bloober Team's more recent Silent Hill 2 remake, there were still plenty of reasons to be skeptical going into this one. Even though I had a really rocky start with it, I ended up finishing multiple playthroughs with each ending, earning the Platinum Trophy in the process. And by the time I wrapped things up, I found that my overall thoughts on the game had improved the more I played, even if said thoughts are rather complicated. Having the game take place in a small town in 1960s Japan versus the more traditional American town was something that I ended up appreciating. The atmosphere of this fog-filled town, accompanied by the music and soundscape by longtime series composer Akira Yamaoka, is outstanding. Meanwhile, the Otherworld segments were done by composer Kensuke Inage, bringing an entirely different and equally haunting feeling to these areas altogether. I highly recommend playing this game with headphones on, as it really adds so much to the unsettling nature of the game. Speaking of, this is also probably the most grotesque Silent Hill game to date, featuring some imagery that can absolutely be really hard for some people to stomach. The horror elements as a whole are some of the best aspects to Silent Hill F, though it's still guilty of having the odd enemy jump scare here and there. Combat, on the other hand, really started to test my patience at times. Now, the Silent Hill series isn't known for having good combat, which was never an issue for me since I always tend to avoid fights whenever possible to save on supplies. But in Silent Hill F, there is a rather large focus on melee combat. Not only do you have to manage your stamina and sanity meters, but you have to be mindful of your weapon durability as well, at least while in town. Durability doesn't matter during the Otherworld segments. While there is nothing wrong with these mechanics, the problem is that actually fighting the enemies feels rather jank. Dodging can feel rather unresponsive at the worst times, making it far too risky to get some decent hits in. Most encounters for me involved baiting enemy attacks that were counterable, which is far and away the most useful combat tool. And don't be like me during my first playthrough and neglect the focus mode that slows down time to make hitting the counter window easier. My misreading of a tooltip made me believe that the focus mode would permanently deplete the sanity meter, which it does not. And trust me, you'll need it since Silent Hill F is a much more difficult game than I was expecting. For reference, I did pick hard mode for both the combat and puzzle difficulties to start, which, by the way, is something that I'm very happy that the Silent Hill games are still doing. But the way the game worded hard mode made it seem like it was realistically the normal mode, as the next step down was called story difficulty. It's not one of the hardest games I've ever played or anything, since checkpoints are rather plentiful and forgiving, but I wasn't prepared for all of the frustrating deaths thanks to the clunky combat and high enemy damage. Now, there are moments outside of boss fights where it is totally feasible to avoid combat if needed, like how I would have done with the older titles. But there are so many instances later in the game where combat is outright forced, and those moments are where the game gets far too annoying and, quite frankly, not fun for its own good. And it gets even worse when you have to deal with larger groups of enemies. On the plus side, the numerous shrines throughout the game allow you to upgrade Hinako's stats, as well as obtain these omamori that provide unique bonuses that can help with things like healing or less stamina use. And the whole idea of making the choice to either save certain recovery items versus offering them to the shrine for upgrade currency is such a smart element to the game that I really liked, at least during my very first playthrough. I won't go into too much detail regarding the story because I do want to avoid spoiling things, but I feel like the narrative carries this game on its back because without it, I would have been a lot more down on Silent Hill F as a whole. Considering that the story was done by Ryukishi07, the man responsible for both the Higurashi and Yumineko series, there was a chance for this game's narrative to at least be captivating, and I think that he totally delivered on that front. I ended up playing the game with the English VA, and I personally thought they did a good job, though I have heard that the Japanese VA performances were stellar by comparison. The intrigue of both the plot and the themes present in the game kept me thinking about what would happen next the whole way through. Then a notable change to the context of the story taking place during New Game Plus and onward kept that intrigue going. Yes, in order to get the full extent of the story, multiple playthroughs and endings are required. This can definitely be a deal breaker to some, but to me it ended up being one other strong aspect to the game. And thankfully, any upgrades and omamori from the previous playthroughs are carried over, making a lot of the combat a bit more tolerable going forward. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have even bothered. While there's a lot I like about the game, things like the annoying and clunky nature of the combat drag the experience down for me. It's a shame too, cause there's a lot here I enjoy, even with all of my personal complaints. At the very least, I'm more open to see more Silent Hill games like this versus whatever the hell Ascension was. In short, I like Silent Hill F. I just wish I loved Silent Hill F. Moving away from all of the Spooktober stuff, but staying on the subject of Konami, Metal Gear Solid Delta Snake Eater, the Unreal Engine 5 remake of Metal Gear Solid 3, was the first ever time I played all the way through MGS3. Because of my endless paranoia of being terrible at these games, I keep dragging my feet in regards to playing the older entries, with MGS4 and both MGS5 games being the only ones I finished so far. While I may be constantly hard on myself with my skill level, Delta ended up being a surprisingly good time. From what I was able to gather with only secondhand knowledge of Snake Eater, the remake stays pretty faithful to the original, keeping the level design, encounters, and voice work intact. Obviously, the biggest overhauls here are the graphics and gameplay, and while the visuals do lose a small bit of the original artistic intent, it's still a really good looking game, with character models and the various environments getting an enormous facelift. Delta even gives players the choice between playing with the legacy or new playstyles. The new style, which is what I went with, uses a typical third-person camera not unlike the Subsistence release of MGS3, though some mechanics like enemy line of sight and having bullet drop on your trank gun are adjusted to compensate for the more modern control scheme. Legacy style, on the other hand, sticks far more closer to the original game's camera and control layout. It's really cool to have these options, even going far enough to allow players to switch between them at any given time. It even went as far as to bring back the Snake vs. Monkey minigame, at least on PlayStation 5, and even redo the Nightmare Hack and Slash minigame from the original, this time being done by Platinum Games. There's a lot more respect shown for Snake Eater in this remake than I would have expected out of modern-day Konami, let alone for a game originally directed by Hideo Kojima. Go ahead and call me a Metal Gear fraud or whatever, but I think that Delta is all in all a damn fine remake. I still wouldn't call this a necessary remake by any means, because it really isn't. But the good news is that the original game is still easily available for anyone to grab, thanks to Volume 1 of the Master Collection. For anyone who's already very familiar with MGS3 that's curious about Delta, don't pick it up at full price. It tends to go on sale quite often by now, so I would suggest waiting on a good one before picking this one up.
I'm still in a dream, Snake Eater.
Hideo Kojima may have had nothing to do with the Metal Gear Solid 3 remake, but he did deliver his next game in 2025 with Death Stranding 2 on the beach. I'm actually someone that quite liked the original Death Stranding, with its focus on optimizing safe traversal and deliveries, and its weird yet somehow engaging plot keeping me hooked until the end. It was an experience that managed to stand out from any other game I was more likely to be playing at the time. With Death Stranding 2, I was bound to expect something similar while being curious to see what the team could have added onto its current foundation. What I ended up getting was, in short, a much more streamlined version of Death Stranding. That's not to say that it's a bad thing. If anything, it allows players to get adjusted to the quirks and nuances of trekking across Australia much faster than you could traveling America in the original. And being a direct sequel, it does at the very least make sense that a lot of the tools that were slowly introduced in the first game show up earlier here than before. It is, however, a double-edged sword, since this ends up trivializing a majority of traversal way too quickly. This also applies to the combat against human enemies and BTs, which, if anything, remains mostly unchanged from the first game when it comes to properly dispatching them. While it does up the pace, getting access to vehicles much earlier than in the original completely removes a lot of the risk of doing safe deliveries to new locations on foot. Once I got the truck, I spent nearly the rest of the game being glued to the driver's seat because it was almost always the most viable option. As an unintentional side effect of this, Death Stranding 2 ended up becoming a bit of a relaxing game for me to play. Anytime I just wanted to chill while making progress in the story, the truck allowed me to sit back and take in the beautiful yet desolate world of the game. Taking place about 11 months after Death Stranding, the story this time around has Sam connecting the continent of Australia working under the newly formed drawbridge. I won't say too much here for obvious spoiler reasons, but the game is about as weird yet captivating as before, this time tackling themes such as grief and loss among its varied cast of characters. It also has a finale sequence that is so ridiculous, I can't tell if it's one of the greatest things ever or one of the dumbest things ever. Whichever it may be, it is by all accounts a Kojima game. Since I took my sweet time with Death Stranding 2, it ended up taking me a fair bit to wrap things up, and by the end, I felt pretty satisfied overall. I do think as a collective whole though, the first Death Stranding is much better than the sequel. On the Beach does lose quite a bit of what made the original's delivery gameplay actually engaging for me. Having to think carefully about my route and what to take with me to uncharted territory was something that, at the time, I wasn't expecting to get hooked on. So it's rather disappointing that the sequel loses this element far too quickly for the sake of streamlining, even if I did manage to still have fun. I will say this though, if you're someone that bounced off of Death Stranding hard, I don't think the sequel is going to change your mind.
Pizza! Pizza! Hey, pizza's here.
Luminous Arise was another relaxation game for me, one that makes a lot more sense for this label compared to Death Stranding 2. Arise takes the same approach to its visuals and music as Enhance's previous work on 2018's Tetris Effect, and applies it to Tetsuya Mizuguchi's own puzzle game series. I've always been a fan since the Xbox Live Arcade release Luminous Live, and considering how much I fell in love with Tetris Effect, Arise was an easy get for me. Having received the game on my birthday, I settled in and made it all the way through the game's journey mode, and it was totally mesmerizing. Both the visuals and soundtrack once again managed to captivate my senses all the way until the end. It can be a bit overwhelming at times, with some screen effects even causing me to make some mistakes when I didn't mean to. And while I personally prefer the overall soundtrack in Tetris Effect, Luminous Arise is by no means a slouch in this department, with certain songs and skins becoming instant favorites of mine. This is definitely one game you're gonna want a pair of headphones or a good sound system for. The new burst mechanic, where you can clear blocks by making a big enough single color square, is a neat addition despite me never exactly getting a proper hang of it. And aside from the main journey mode, there are also a multitude of challenges to tackle, as well as online play to keep you busy. Luminous Arise may not have hit me the same way Tetris Effect did back when it came out, but this is very much a puzzle game worth playing, and one of my favorite Luminous games to date. Here's hoping that we'll see a PS5 physical version at some point in the near future. Since my Gamefly rental queue was open a fair bit before release, I decided to rent the newest game in the seemingly endless Call of Duty franchise with Black Ops 7. And before you ask, yes, Gamefly does in fact still exist, and I've been using the service for nearly 2 decades at this point. Despite how often these games get churned out year by year, I tend to check out the campaign in these games first and foremost before turning my brain off for a small amount of its multiplayer. Before my rental even arrived at my mailbox, word of mouth started to spread about how Black Ops 7's campaign was supposedly the worst in the franchise. And you know what? I'm inclined to agree. The campaign of Black Ops 7 fumbles so hard that by the end, I started to question if this game was written or even developed by actual human beings. Following one of the multitude of endings from Black Ops 2, the game centers around the supposed return of the long-deceased Raul Menendez. Following an investigation into the corporation known as the Guild, Mason and his team get exposed to the Cradle, the chemical weapon from Black Ops 6. From that point forward, the campaign devolves into what I could only describe as complete and utter nonsense. You'll be fighting through a bunch of bizarre and mind-bending locations and taking part in some truly ridiculous boss fights. Now normally, this wouldn't even really bother me, but even with the added context of the Cradle causing said hallucinations, the actual story gets so sloppy with its writing that I wouldn't be surprised if it was formed out of a ChatGPT prompt. There's a betrayal involving a character that happens halfway through the game that just comes out of nowhere and gets resolved almost immediately with zero buildup. All you get prior to that is a single mission playing as said character, with the next time you see him being when you find out he's evil. It's a complete and total mess with how jumbled together everything feels. Call of Duty games have always had tight gunplay and game feel, and Black Ops 7 is no different, but I'm just at the point where it can no longer carry the rest of its game on its back. The constant push for these campaigns to keep including Warzone mechanics is so freaking annoying, because I'm not here to play Warzone. You couldn't make me care about Warzone even if you held me at gunpoint. Having the campaign also require an internet connection is a decision I just absolutely despise on a fundamental level. Sure, it's nice being able to have the option to play co-op here, though it didn't exactly make my time with the campaign any better, but requiring a private lobby to be made just for playing solo is completely stupid. Being unable to pause the game while solo alongside the risk of being booted due to inactivity is just the icing on the cake here. What makes even less sense is that despite being in said private lobby, other players with open mics started to show up during the cutscenes. Like, how does that even happen in the first place? What the fuck?
What?
Who's this ghost man? And after finishing the campaign, it dumps you into its endgame, which boils down to being a PvE extraction shooter set on the giant map that you've already ran across during the game. Yeah, no thanks. As for the rest of Black Ops 7, I had my usual junk food-esque experience with the multiplayer for a bit, and I didn't even bother with zombies this time around. But I think it's totally safe to say that the campaign is by far the worst one they have put out. Which is insane to me, since the campaign from the Modern Warfare 3 reboot was the worst one up to this point, and that came out only 2 years prior to Black Ops 7. Even worse is that Black Ops 6 was, in all honesty, pretty solid overall. It's just incredibly insulting that this game was cobbled together and thrown out into the world just because Call of Duty refuses to not have a new release every single year. I was originally going to skip out on Battlefield 6, but an enticing sale on Black Friday was just enough for me to pick it up. Before hopping into the multiplayer, you know, the entire focus of any given Battlefield game, my curiosity had me check out the single-player campaign first. It wasn't too surprising to find out that it's not very good. But unlike the Black Ops 7 campaign for comparison's sake, it's bad for more traditional and rather boring reasons. It's got a storyline that fails to do or even say anything remotely interesting until maybe the final cutscene, and that's just me being generous. The game gave me zero reason for me to care about what was going on in the slightest. It's just another excuse to go and shoot paramilitary soldiers for the next 5 or so hours. The campaign's gameplay and structure does try to keep things varied throughout its run, but none of them are particularly memorable or stand out all that much. It's not for a lack of trying or anything. For example, one moment has you fighting in a dark war memorial with soldiers hiding among mannequins, and another has you doing a mandatory but brief and linear stealth segment. Being able to command your squad mates is also a bit of a waste, as it just boils down to picking an ability to use in battle, with the only really useful one being the one that reveals every enemy on screen. Honestly, I'm just struggling trying to find more things to say about the campaign here. It just ended up being far too dull for what it is, and outside of a few in-game unlocks, it was really not worth my time. On the other hand, the multiplayer was absolutely worth the time I spent on it. Being someone who stopped playing the franchise after Battlefield 1, the amount of fun I was having with 6 made me realize how much I missed the core gameplay of Battlefield. Gunplay feels great, and falling back into my preferred role of medic and ammo support brought me right back to the days where this franchise had its hooks in me. Getting completely stomped by opposing teams still stings a ton, but that also makes the eventual victories all the more satisfying. And being able to squad up with my online friends who have the game as well made playing these matches so much more enjoyable. Despite there being multiple modes of play, I still tend to stick with the tried and true Conquest mode. Most other modes like Rush and Squad Deathmatch are fine enough, and Red Sec, the game's Battle Royale mode, is something that I will never bother with, as I simply do not like Battle Royale games. I do hope that Battlefield 6 stays strong in the coming years, as I wouldn't mind coming back on my off time to play a few more matches. If you're someone that got burned by some of the more recent installments, this one is honestly a good return to form. Well, for the multiplayer at least. You can skip the campaign. So, I feel like I need to explain this one. I rented Mind's Eye with the sole intent to dunk on it while playing it on my live stream. With it being one of the worst reviewed new releases of 2025, alongside the numerous other ways it and its developer Build a Rocket Boy made its rounds in the gaming news world, there was a part of me that simply could not resist. This game always made me raise an eyebrow prior to release, since IO Interactive, the developers of Hitman and the new Bond game, was publishing this game under their new IOI Partners label, with me not being sure what to make of it. I was fairly certain I had a very good idea of what to expect going in for the very first time based on all of the negative reviews. But let it be known, I was not prepared for what Mind's Eye had in store for me. This game ended up baffling me in so many different ways that I really don't even know where to begin. I guess I can just start with the plot. So, our protagonist, Jacob Diaz, suffered from memory loss thanks to something going wrong with his neural implant related to an incident while he was in the military. He ends up joining the Silva Corporation to work as a security guard, though he's using his new job position in order to find answers as to why he's having all these head glitches. That's more or less how the story starts off, but during the roughly 10 to 12 hour runtime, things just eventually go completely off the rails. Adding to this is the number of characters that Jacob befriends along the way. Some examples include a hacker girl that wears weed earrings, a spoiled rich boy that is germophobic, a scientist that's into conspiracy theories and robots, and bald Adam Jensen. What makes it even weirder is that the performances from the main cast are serviceable throughout, but there's only so much these actors could have done considering the script they had to work with. The amount of times I had to hear "Call Rigby" during my playthrough nearly made me turn that into its own drinking game.
Call Rigby, call Rigby, call Rigby, call Rigby, call Rigby, call Rigby.
Even with Mind's Eye taking place in the near future, the direction that the story headed towards was one of the last things I could have possibly foreseen, with the events that occur bordering on outright insanity. When I made it to the final act and reached the game's ending that follows, it was enough to make me completely lose it. No, you don't cut the credits! Gameplay-wise, it's a pretty standard third-person shooter that closely resembles some of the more modern Grand Theft Auto games, which makes sense considering the development background of some of the team that worked on Mind's Eye. Shooting feels average for the most part, but a huge grin formed on my face once I discovered that this game falls into the corner cheating category for me, where using the cover system becomes 100% useless thanks to being able to shoot around corners while being totally safe from gunfire. Meanwhile, I can't say much about either the driving or flying, as they both work totally fine outside of me intentionally trying to break the game with both. One other carryover from the GTA games is the structure of the main story missions. Nearly all of them require you to travel from one point to the next in order to engage in whatever objective the mission may entail. The key difference, though, is that these missions have 0 breaks in between, meaning you'll be starting the next one immediately as the game gives you no downtime to explore the open world of Red Rock. There is free roam when you finish the game, but I'll get back to that. Alternatively, the game has these portals that act as the game's side content, which in turn ended up making this game even more bizarre. Initially, it seemed like these were flashbacks that covered more of Jacob's time in the military, but then you get ones that have nothing to do with Jacob, like a robot-based tower defense mission, or one where you play as a random person shooting a bunch of cars. If the game didn't already have me scratching my head by this point, then this definitely would have done the trick. While everything I've talked about so far, minus the story, seems rather bog standard, what ended up pushing Mind's Eye over the edge and into absolute legend status for me was the pure instability of the game. Playing on my regular PS5, this is not a great looking or running game in general, as it showcases all of the numerous issues that can plague a title running on Unreal Engine 5. And this was apparently the patched version. The only thing I could call good here are the character models, but even they aren't safe from this game falling apart at the seams. The amount of graphical and gameplay glitches I came across in Mind's Eye were so numerous that it actually amplified my enjoyment of the game to an extreme degree. Here are some of the highlights from my stream of the game so you can see for yourself. Whoa! Did you see that? That scared the shit out of me! You good, girl? What? What the fuck? Oh, man. Oh, that was the best landing yet. It was like, shit. A little late for that, buddy.
Y'all share a mother tongue, but
there's nothing on the screen.
One symbol.
There's nothing on the screen.
Over and over again.
What are you trying to show me? There's nothing. Whoa. Whoa, what the fuck are you doing? I can't trust stealth like that.
I can't.
Oh my god!
She's off the grid.
All of my personal data! My financials, everything!
What happened to Rigby? Call her back! Alongside all of this, some of the other gameplay design decisions left me speechless. For example, that post-game free roam mode I mentioned earlier, it puts you into the boots of this gas mask wearing grandpa and drops you into the world with absolutely nothing to do. This game is something else. The last thing I expected out of Mind's Eye was it being one of the most absurd and hilarious gaming experiences I've had all year, which is clearly not what the developers were aiming for. I even went as far as to get myself a physical copy for my collection. And the best part? A used copy from Gamefly was on sale for so cheap that my existing coupons ended up paying for the game all on its own, meaning I got the game for free. That alone means that it's clearly the greatest game ever made. Okay, to be serious for a moment, yes, it totally makes sense why this turned out to be one of the worst games released in 2025, and it's a sentiment that I pretty much agree with. But at the same time, I have still played many games far worse than Mind's Eye. Hell, I've played games that are by all accounts better made that I had less fun with compared to Mind's Eye. Seriously, if you're someone that gets major enjoyment from bad video games and have a means of doing so, Mind's Eye comes highly recommended for me. For pretty much anyone else on planet Earth, you can steer clear.
Please get back to the factory ASAP. I'm on my way.
Alright, all that's left now are my two personal picks for Game of the Year. There's the more traditional pick for 2025, but I first wanted to talk about my new-to-me Game of the Year, based solely on all of the older titles I played for the first time. There were so many good retro titles that I could have picked a fair amount of them as my personal favorite. But having reflected back on my time with them, my final choice ended up being a bit of a no-brainer to me. Which is shocking, since this was a game that, despite being on my radar for nearly 2 decades, was one that I wasn't entirely sure I was going to end up liking. Growing up with the GameCube around the early 2000s, my very first exposure to Baten Kaido's Eternal Wings in the Lost Ocean was all thanks to watching the CG trailer off of the internet. I remember being mesmerized by the visuals and the musical score to the point where I kept rewatching it and some various gameplay clips from IGN over and over again. Over time, I got turned away from the game thanks to some rather middling reviews, both from an old friend from middle school and the lawless wasteland of G4 TV. It still remained on the back of my mind, however, eventually leading me to picking up both it and its sequel/prequel, Baten Kaido's Origins, for real cheap at my local GameStop many years back. Despite having a bit of a false start with the game back in 2023, I decided to start over from scratch and made sure to stick with it all the way to the end this time around. All of those worries I had about the game after all these years ended up washing away, because Baten Kaidos became one of my favorite games that I played in all of 2025. Thanks to the beautiful artwork of this game's pre-rendered backgrounds and the unique character designs, the game holds up really well visually, even today. Each island continent you'll be visiting on your journey has its own distinct look and feeling that makes them stand out from one another, with some locations being pretty far out there in terms of its design. Accompanying all of this is the wonderful soundtrack composed by industry veteran Motoi Sakuraba. The music was always the #1 thing about Baten Kaidos that stuck with me for many years, despite not actually having played the game until very recently. And now that I got to experience the entire soundtrack this time around, this may be one of my favorite OSTs that Sakuraba has done, considering just how many games he's worked on over the years. If there was one element of Baten Kaidos that always had me worried going into it, it was the card-based battle system. To be blunt, I'm not someone who is really into anything related to cards or deck building in the slightest. My only real previous go at anything card related in video games was when I played Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories on the GBA back when I was young. So to say that Baten Kaidos' battle system looked intimidating to me would be putting it lightly, with me even going as far as to study the instruction manual before playing to make sure I even knew how it all worked. And after about a couple of hours, something clicked, and I soon found myself really enjoying the battle system. Getting a good hand in earning damage bonuses by playing straights or pairs with the spirit number system feels fantastic when it happens, and is an aspect that rewards smart deck building. However, this is a game where the battle system spreads its wings, so to speak, as the game progresses. The amount of Magnus, aka the cards in this game's world, that you're able to play in combat is very limiting at first, meaning that you're barely able to take advantage of the spirit numbers or element system. The luck of the draw is also a downside you'll have to deal with, as if you're someone that wants to have a balance of attack and defense Magnus in your deck, you may get many hands in a row where you can't attack and are forced to waste a turn as a result. It can be an annoying aspect of the combat, but since the game was mostly steady with its difficulty outside of a quick spike here and there, I was almost always willing to engage in battle, even more so since the game forgoes random battles in general, which is really nice. And for what it's worth, I actually ended up enjoying the story and characters in Baten Kaidos. I may not have been on board with every character, but I found myself enjoying my time with most of the main cast here, always curious about their motivations and backstories. What makes things interesting is that you, the player, are also a character in the story, acting as protagonist Callus's guardian spirit. Most of the time you're watching along with the events that transpire, but every so often both Callus and the others will ask you for input, which in turn can affect things like getting special attack magnets during combat. And while most of the actual story does fall into typical JRPG territory, it still managed to contain a very surprising plot twist. Based on in-game context clues, I was able to correctly predict said plot twist early on, only for me to still get the rug pulled out from under me because I missed one crucial detail. However, there is one major thing that did rob the game of whatever emotional moments it could have had. I am, of course, talking about Baten Kaitos' infamously bad English voice acting. As a collective whole, it's not the absolute worst voice acting I've heard, as there are a very small amount of performances here that are just merely okay. That being said, the performances from nearly everyone else, ranging from both very minor and very major characters, are just laughably terrible. There were so many key moments in the story I couldn't take seriously thanks to how much the voice acting was making me laugh. It got to the point where I couldn't help but be completely endeared by how bad some of it was, with party member Liud being the absolute king in this regard.
It's unthinkable to act against the Empire! I will not cower. Call me what you will, but I stand only for justice. I tried!
For a game that has the kinds of flaws that it does, it still wasn't enough to stop me from falling in love with Baten Kaitos by the end of it all. So much so that it ended up landing itself a place on my personal list of top 10 GameCube exclusives, let alone on my embarrassingly small list of favorite JRPGs. I really do think more people should give this game a chance, as it's a fun RPG that holds up really well once you understand how it all works. There is that more recent HD remaster collection for Switch and PC, but after my very brief time with it, I don't know if it's exactly the ideal version. Sure, it has nice quality of life options like autosave and increasing battle speed, the latter being pretty helpful to offset the stupidly slow animations that Giacomo does during his boss fights. But the updated visuals in regards to the character models and background art don't look nearly as good as the GameCube version to my eyes, almost like some of it was just a sloppy upscaling job. It also has no English VA to speak of, which in regards to the first Baten Kaitos might be a good thing to some, but there is still that bit of charm with the bad voice acting that I do kind of miss with this release. I won't say that the remaster is a bad option or anything, but I would recommend the GameCube version first and foremost. Either way, I had an incredible time with Baten Kaitos, and I'm so glad that I ended up liking it after decades of uncertainty. I'm planning to play Baten Kaitos Origins in the future, but since I've heard that game is much more challenging with its difficulty and revamped battle system, I'm gonna hold off for a while before I'm ready to dive right in. But for now, I think it's safe for me to say that Baten Kaitos Eternal Wings in the Lost Ocean is my new-to-me game of the year for 2025.
Harder! Harder! Harder!
So, what about my actual game of the year? Anyone that has been following along with my live streams should be well aware of what that game is by now. To everyone else, you might look at my choice and happily agree, or you might scoff at how predictable of a pick it is. I mean, sure, based on where we are now, it can be seen as the safe and easy pick. But if we go all the way back to January 2025, I don't think any of us could have foreseen or have even been prepared for the massive impact this game would end up having. I'm not afraid to admit that I originally overlooked Clear Obscure Expedition 33 during its reveal at the Xbox Developer Showcase. I didn't think it looked bad or anything, but at the time, I just wasn't in the mood or mindset for a brand new RPG. Fast forward to its launch in April of 2025, not long after returning from my France vacation funnily enough, the overwhelmingly high praise I was seeing from both review outlets and players alike took me by complete surprise. About a week later, I contemplated on picking up a copy while I was wandering around my local GameStop, with the $50 price point eventually being the deciding factor. As luck would have it, it was the last copy they had, and it shockingly rang up as $40 at checkout, and this was well before news broke out about physical copies being hard to find at the time. I was originally going to play this one on my own, only doing a one-off stream just for the hell of it. Not counting an unfortunate power outage that happened during said stream, that one-off slowly turned into 2, then 3. Next thing I knew, I kept going out of my way to stream this game at any given opportunity. I was completely glued to Expedition 33, and the more I played, the more I felt like I was experiencing something truly special. Being a guy who has enjoyed games such as Super Mario RPG and the like, the active nature of the turn-based battle system was engaging for me right from the get-go. The addition of each party member having their own innate combat style made learning how to efficiently utilize their skills and movesets so much fun, with new ones being introduced at just the right time to make battles all the more interesting. That, and figuring out each enemy's moves to properly dodge or parry incoming attacks, led to an addicting combat loop that I couldn't get enough of, both when it came to fighting regular enemies and especially the boss fights. Pulling off a successful counter after landing multiple tricky parries in a row feels incredible, with the great audio and visual feedback amplifying that satisfaction. That's not even getting into the admittedly overwhelming Pictos and Luminous system. They're both easy enough to understand, but as you make your way through the game, you'll be having loads of these things on hand, trying to decide what special abilities are the best to beef up each of your party members. Because there are just so many to choose from, it allows you to eventually make some character builds that can, for better and for worse, break this game in half. The combat wasn't the only thing I fell in love with. Both the overall presentation and narrative of Clair Obscur kept me equally invested all the way up to the credits. The painted style of this game's setting is simply beautiful, with the world and its numerous locations and enemy designs always giving me something new to look forward to as I played. And despite being yet another game that runs on Unreal Engine 5, this one manages to be a standout with how good it utilizes the engine compared to other games using the tech. And the music. My god, the music. Laurent Testard's score for Clair Obscur quickly shot itself up as one of my favorite soundtracks of not just 2025, but the past couple of years, period. It made a very good impression at the start, but the further I got in the game, the better the music got. Then, it got even better. And somehow, it got better than that. This eventually culminated in a song that, quite frankly, left me completely stunned once I heard it for the very first time, and became without a doubt my favorite video game song of the year.
Let's carve a
Ugh. Should I turn the music up? Coinciding with the strong art direction and amazing soundtrack was the highly compelling nature of the story and its premise. Stakes felt high right from the get-go, and the journey that Expedition 33 goes on to take down the Paintress led to so many memorable moments for me. I found myself truly caring about the characters and the events that transpire throughout the game. And all of the things you end up learning about them, either from main story beats or via camp conversations, add so much to their individual personalities. This was enhanced even further thanks to the outstanding voice performances from the entire cast, making every major event all the more impactful. While I love the more serious nature of the story, I also really appreciated the moments where it decided to be a bit more playful and lighthearted, thanks in part to certain characters and the number of side activities that I got a kick out of, despite them not exactly being well polished from a gameplay standpoint. And while this may be a bit of a controversial stance, I feel like the story managed to stick the landing with its ending. I wasn't fully sure how I felt about it initially, but after reflecting upon it for a while, I've grown to really appreciate how the game wraps everything up after all is said and done. I'm not someone that cares too deeply about yearly events like the Game Awards.
Mon ami, Clair Obscur, Expedition 33!
But this was one of the rare instances where I felt a game like Expedition 33 deserved a majority of the awards it was nominated for. That being said, I don't think we'll ever see such a gigantic sweep like this one ever again, or at least for many, many years. It's been a long while since I felt this strongly about a brand new video game release. I think the last couple of times something like this has happened with me was when I played both Nier Automata and 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. It is by no means perfect, as I do think some of the structure in the last third of the game wasn't as strong as what came before it. But whatever issues I may have had doesn't erase how much I adored playing Clair Obscur Expedition 33. Sandfall's work on this game was simply outstanding, and I'm now extremely curious about what this French studio will be cooking up next. My only regret is that I still haven't done all the post-game content yet, not counting anything added in the game's more recent updates. I'll go back and take that stuff on someday, I just gotta find the spare time and motivation to do so. Overall, if you're into the RPG genre and haven't done so yet for one reason or another, trust me when I say that you're in for a treat with Expedition 33. It's my game of the year for 2025, and really, nothing else came close.
For those who come after.
Well, I think that just about covers everything. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how many games I managed to finish in 2025. Now, whether or not I'll even be able to come close to that amount for 2026 remains to be seen. But having already gone through new releases like Resident Evil Requiem, I think it's safe to say that I'll still be finding newer games to enjoy in the coming year. Otherwise, well, I've always got my backlog that I can rely on when the time is right. Until then, here's to whatever may be in store for us for the rest of 2026, gaming or otherwise. You fucking farted at the end, I can't believe it. Ah!